True stories from abandoned prisons that will make you wish you never stepped foot in one. These ghostly horrors will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends, if you even make it through the entire thing. What happens in the darkness doesn't stay in the darkness. The storm rolled in like a harbinger of doom, lightning illuminating the crumbling silhouette of Blackridge Penitentiary. Its towering walls and barbed wire fences stood as monuments to misery, long abandoned yet still exuding a sinister aura. To the world, Blackridge was an eyesore, a place to be forgotten. To thrill seekers like Maddie, Alex, and Derek, it was the ultimate ghost hunting destination. "Are we really doing this?" Maddie asked, gripping her camera tightly as the trio parked their SUV at the overgrown entrance. The headlights illuminated the rusted gates, chained shut but easy enough to climb. Alex, the fearless leader of their group, smirked. "Come on, Maddie, don't tell me you're chickening out. We've investigated cemeteries, haunted hotels, and even that abandoned asylum. This place will be a piece of cake." Derek, the group's tech expert, adjusted his backpack filled with EMF detectors, night vision cameras, and thermal imaging gear. Besides, Blackridge is famous. They say the warden's ghost still haunts the halls, punishing anyone who dares step inside. Maddie shuddered. She had read the stories, how Warden Elias Grayson had ruled Blackridge with an iron fist in the early 1900s, subjecting inmates to unspeakable cruelty. His collection of medieval torture devices was infamous, earning him the nickname the Executioner. When an inmate uprising led to Grayson's death, the rumors began. Inmates claimed to hear his boots echoing through the halls long after he was buried. Some swore they saw his shadow stalking the corridors, dragging chains as if searching for his next victim. The three scaled the gate and entered the grounds. Weeds sprouted through cracks in the pavement, and the prison loomed before them like a beast waiting to devour its prey. Inside, the air was heavy with decay and mildew. Broken glass crunched under their boots as they navigated the first corridor. Maddie's flashlight illuminated peeling paint and graffiti, the words "Abandoned Hope" scrawled in red on the walls. "Charming," Maddie muttered, trying to mask her unease. Derek set up the first camera near the cell block entrance. "Let's see if the warden's still home." As they ventured deeper, the oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water or the rustle of rats. Maddie's heart raced as they approached the central guard station, a circular room with views of every wing. A massive, rusted chair dominated the center, Grayson's throne, where he watched over his domain like a king. Alex sat in the chair, grinning. "Do you feel that? The power? The control?" "Cut it out, Alex," Maddie snapped. But as she looked around, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came in cell block D. The cells yawned open like hungry mouths, their iron bars twisted as if by some inhuman force. Derek placed an EMF detector on the ground, its green light blinking steadily. Suddenly, the device spiked to red. Maddie's camera captured the moment as a loud metallic clang echoed through the block. "What the hell was that?" Derek whispered. Alex shined his flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a cell door swinging shut, though there was no wind. Maddie gasped as a faint whisper filled the air, low and guttural, as if someone were speaking just behind her. "Who's there?" Alex called out. The only response was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. The group huddled together, their breaths fogging in the cold. Maddie's heart pounded as she scanned the corridor, but there was no one there. Yet the footsteps continued, circling them, growing louder with each pass. Desperate to escape the haunting footsteps, the group retreated to another wing of the prison. They stumbled into a room that sent a chill down Maddie's spine. Chains hung from the ceiling, and a table with leather restraints sat in the center. Rusted instruments lined the walls. Blades, pincers, and other tools of torment. "The torture chamber," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where Grayson brought the inmates who disobeyed him." Maddie's camera picked up faint scratches on the walls, names etched by desperate hands. She traced her fingers over one. "James H. Forgive me." Derek set up a thermal camera, and as the lens scanned the room, a shape appeared. vaguely humanoid, glowing cold blue. Maddie's breath caught in her throat. Is that? Alex began, but his words were drowned out by a sudden scream. It was a woman's voice, shrill and filled with agony, echoing through the halls. The group froze. Maddie clutched her camera like a lifeline. That sounded real. It's just residual energy, Derek said, though his hands trembled as he checked the thermal camera. The figure was gone. Then the chains rattled, swinging violently as though an unseen force had grabbed them. Maddie backed toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Maddie stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hands. The grotesque apparition of Warden Grayson loomed closer, his eyes burning with an unholy light, his cracked, bloodless lips curling into a grotesque grin. Every corridor she sprinted down seemed to lead her back to the central cell block, as though the prison itself had come alive, shifting and twisting its architecture to trap her. Her friends' voices still echoed faintly in the air, not their real voices, but mocking, distorted mimics. Help me, Maddie! Why did you leave me? The cries of agony layered with the clinking of chains created a symphony of despair. Maddie covered her ears and screamed, but the noises only grew louder, clawing at her sanity. She turned a corner and saw something new, a small, decrepit chapel. The wooden pews were rotten, and the stained glass windows depicted horrifying scenes. Inmates being tortured, flames consuming helpless souls, and at the center, a skeletal figure in a warden's hat standing triumphant. As Maddie stepped closer, she felt a rush of icy air whip around her. A cold, skeletal hand shot out from the altar, gripping her ankle. She fell hard, scraping her palms on the stone floor. Did you think you could escape, child? The warden's voice was everywhere, booming and oppressive, filled with the weight of centuries of torment. Maddie screamed, kicking at the bony hand until it released her. She scrambled to her feet and ran into the depths of the prison, finding herself in an old torture chamber. Chains hung from the walls and rusted medieval devices filled the room, iron maidens, racks, and thumbscrews. But what was once rusted now gleamed as if freshly polished, as if they had been waiting for a victim. Maddie turned toward the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening clang. She felt something brush her shoulder and spun around, her breath catching. The air shimmered, and ghostly figures of inmates began to appear, each mangled and bloodied from their time under the warden's hand. One by one, they turned their eyeless sockets toward her, accusing her with silent stares. The chains on the wall rattled and began to move on their own, snaking toward Maddie like metallic serpents. She backed into the corner, hyperventilating, as the ghosts began to chant in unison. The warden will have his due. Blood for blood. The chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles, yanking her toward the Iron Maiden in the center of the room. She screamed, struggling against the inhuman strength of the cold metal. Just as she was pulled within inches of the spiked door, she managed to grab a shard of glass from the floor and slice through one of the chains. With a surge of adrenaline, Maddie freed herself and bolted out of the room, but not before hearing the warden's chilling laugh. Maddie stumbled into the courtyard, her breath fogging in the cold night air. She clutched her bleeding wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs. The prison gates were in sight, but so was the warden standing at the exit, waiting for her. His form had shifted, no longer fully human. His body stretched unnaturally tall, with gnarled limbs and a face that was a twisted mask of flesh and bone. His eyes burned brighter than ever, piercing into Maddie's soul. You thought you could run, but Blackridge is a tomb, and you are its newest occupant. Maddie backed away, looking around for anything she could use as a weapon. Her flashlight flickered out, plunging her into near darkness. Desperate, she grabbed a rusted metal rod from the ground. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her shaking hands betrayed her words. The warden laughed, a sound like metal scraping against stone. "Oh, but you will be." The ground beneath her feet cracked, and skeletal hands emerged, clawing at her legs. She swung the rod wildly, breaking free and charged at the warden. As she swung, he caught the rod effortlessly, his strength inhuman. With a flick of his wrist, he sent Maddie flying into the stone wall. Dazed but not defeated, Maddie remembered the vial of holy water in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling. This ends now! She hurled the vial at the warden. It shattered against his chest, and for a moment, his form flickered, his screams filling the night. The ghosts of the inmates began to appear around him, their forms solidifying as they surrounded their tormentor. "No! You are mine!" the warden roared. But the ghosts dragged him down into the earth, their skeletal hands clawing and tearing at his spectral flesh. As the warden disappeared, the prison began to collapse, its walls crumbling as if the curse that held it together was finally broken. Maddie ran, dodging falling debris, and made it through the gates just as the entire structure imploded, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. Maddie sat in her car, her body shaking with exhaustion and terror. She looked back at the ruined prison, now silent and still. She thought she was free, but as she started the engine, her rearview mirror revealed something chilling. The warden's face stared back at her, grinning before whispering, "You can't escape me." The car engine sputtered, and the radio crackled to life with the warden's maniacal laughter. Maddie screamed, but the world outside remained oblivious, the nightmare far from over. The night had an eerie weight to it as the group approached the abandoned Blackstone Penitentiary. Rain drizzled steadily, soaking the cracked pavement of the forgotten road. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The penitentiary loomed ahead like a relic from a darker time, its jagged silhouette outlined by sporadic flashes of lightning. Jake drove the battered SUV, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as the vehicle rattled over potholes. In the passenger seat, Lucy scrolled through her phone, unimpressed by the spooky ambience. "Blackstone Penitentiary," she read aloud, "closed in 1987 due to inhumane practices and mysterious disappearances. Great choice for a fun night out, Jake." Jake smirked, adjusting his backwards cap. "You'll thank me when this goes viral. Ghost hunters eat this stuff up." From the back seat, Ben leaned forward, his excitement barely contained. "Did you know over 200 executions happened here? Electric chair, hangings, even firing squads. This place is basically death's playground." Mia sat beside him, clutching her jacket tightly. She hadn't spoken much during the drive, but her unease was palpable. Her dark eyes flickered to the penitentiary as it grew larger through the windshield. "Do we really need to do this?" she asked softly. Ben laughed. "Come on, Mia, live a little. We'll be fine. It's just an old, creepy building." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the building wasn't just creepy, it was alive. The SUV rolled to a stop outside the main gates, which were nearly swallowed by overgrown weeds and ivy. The wrought iron bars were twisted in places, as if something massive had once tried to force its way in, or out. Above the entrance, a weathered sign creaked in the wind. "Blackstone Penitentiary, Justice Through Order." Jake grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and hopped out. "All right, team. Cameras, flashlights, and guts. Let's make this the best night ever." Lucy groaned, pulling on her jacket. "You're way too hyped about this." Ben slung his backpack over his shoulder, packed with recording gear and snacks. He nudged Mia as she hesitated to leave the car. "Hey, it'll be fun. Just stick with me, okay?" Mia nodded reluctantly, stepping out into the rain. The air was colder here, sharper, and every breath she took seemed to weigh heavier in her chest. The group squeezed through a gap in the gates, Jake leading the way. As they stepped onto the cracked concrete courtyard, an unnatural stillness settled over them. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as if the prison itself was holding its breath. Ben whistled, the sound echoing off the crumbling walls. Damn, this place is huge. The prison's facade was a jagged mix of decayed stone and rusting metal. Windows stared down at them like empty eye sockets, their glass long shattered. Lightning illuminated a series of watchtowers, their shapes hulking and menacing against the stormy sky. Lucy checked her phone, groaning. No signal. Perfect. Jake was already filming, panning his camera across the courtyard. Imagine the clicks we'll get when we catch something. Group encounters real ghost at Blackstone. That's 1 million views easy. Mia trailed behind, her gaze darting from shadow to shadow. She could have sworn she saw movement in one of the towers, but when she looked again, it was empty. Pushing open the heavy main doors, the group entered the heart of the penitentiary. The The smell hit them first, a foul mix of mildew, rust, and something far worse. The air was damp, thick, and freezing. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti-covered walls and debris scattered across the floor. Ben whistled again, his voice bouncing off the walls. Creepy as hell. I love it. Lucy ran her hand along a row of old lockers, leaving trails in the grime. This place is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Be careful where you step. Jake ignored her, leading the way deeper into the prison. Let's hit death row first. That's where all the action happened. Mia hesitated, staring down a corridor to their left. The darkness there seemed different, deeper, more alive. She swore she heard faint whispers, just beyond the edge of her hearing. Mia, you coming? Jake called. She snapped out of it, nodding quickly. Yeah, I'm here. The group moved through the prison, their flashlights illuminating scenes of decay and abandonment. Old cells lined the walls, their iron bars warped and rusting. Inside, they found remnants of lives once lived, rotting mattresses, graffiti scrawled in desperation, and the occasional forgotten shoe or shirt. They never left, read one particularly chilling inscription scratched into the wall of a cell. Lucy paused, her skepticism wavering. Okay, that's creepy. Ben grinned. Finally, some atmosphere. Maybe the ghost will actually come out to play. Jake laughed, shining his flashlight into the cell. Let's hope they're photogenic. Mia stayed silent, her unease growing with every step. The whispers she'd heard earlier hadn't stopped. If anything, they were getting louder. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see someone following, but the corridor was empty. They eventually reached the infamous death row wing. The air was colder here, biting through their clothes. The cells were smaller, darker, and more ominous. Each one seemed to exude a sense of despair, as if the very walls had absorbed the anguish of the condemned. At the end of the corridor stood the execution chamber, its heavy metal door slightly ajar. Jake pushed it open with a grin. Welcome to the main event. Inside, the group found the execution chamber in near-perfect condition, as if it had been frozen in time. The electric chair sat in the center, its leather straps frayed but intact. A single spotlight hung above it, casting an unnatural glow over the scene. Ben leaned in close to inspect the chair. Think it still works? Jake laughed. Only one way to find out. Mia shot him a glare. Don't even joke about that. As Jake set up his camera, a low creak echoed through the room. The group froze, their flashlights darting toward the sound. Did anyone else hear that? Lucy asked, her voice shaking. The air grew heavier, the temperature plummeting, and then from the corner of the room, a shadow began to move. The silence in the execution chamber was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the storm outside. The shadow in the corner seemed to pulse, shifting as if it were alive. Jake, ever the skeptic, stepped toward it with his flashlight raised. Relax. It's probably just a coat rack or something, he said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. The light flickered as it reached the corner. Nothing was there. No coat rack, no object to cast the shape that had loomed so menacingly just moments before. See? Just your imagination, Jake said, but his grin faltered. Mia clung to Ben's arm, her wide eyes darting between the chair and the darkened corners of the room. We shouldn't be here. This place, it doesn't want us here. Ben tried to reassure her, though he was starting to feel the weight of the prison's ominous atmosphere himself. It's just an old building, Mia. The scariest thing here is probably tetanus. Lucy leaned against the execution chair, inspecting the rusted straps with detached curiosity. It's crazy to think about how many people sat here, knowing they were about to die. Her words hung in the air like a curse, and the room seemed to grow colder still. As Jake adjusted his camera, the red recording light blinked on. He started narrating, his voice echoing in the chamber. Here we are in the infamous Blackstone execution chamber, where hundreds of prisoners met their end. Legend has it, the ghosts of the executed still linger here, reliving their final moments. A loud clang shattered the quiet, making everyone jump. The sound echoed through the hallways, coming from somewhere just outside the chamber. What the hell was that? Lucy whispered, gripping the back of the chair for support. Jake turned his camera toward the doorway. Stay here. I'll check it out. Mia grabbed his arm. Are you insane? Don't go alone. Jake shrugged her off with a cocky grin. Come on, Mia. What's the worst that could happen? He disappeared into the corridor, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others huddled together, their nerves on edge. The execution chamber felt even more sinister without Jake's bluster to fill the space. Jake followed the sound to a row of cells just outside the execution chamber. His flashlight flickered, its beam revealing rows of rusted bars and empty cells. But one cell wasn't empty. At the far end of the corridor, a figure stood, its back to Jake. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a dark, tattered robe. The figure's head was hooded, obscuring its features. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," Jake called out, his voice shaky despite his attempt at bravado. The figure didn't move. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening on the flashlight. I said, "Who are you?" The figure turned slowly, and Jake's blood ran cold. Its face was hidden in shadow, but two burning red eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto him with an intensity that froze him in place. Suddenly, the figure raised a long, jagged blade, its surface gleaming even in the dim light. The blade was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, ancient and cruel, as if designed for torture rather than execution. Jake stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. By the time he scrambled to pick it up, the figure was gone. Jake burst back into the execution chamber, his face pale and drenched with sweat. "We need to leave." "Now," he said, his voice shaking. Ben raised an eyebrow. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake glared at him. "I'm not kidding, man. There's someone or something out there." Lucy rolled her eyes. "You're just trying to scare us." Mia grabbed Jake's arm. "What did you see?" Jake hesitated, his bravado completely shattered. "I don't know. It was tall. It had a hood, and these eyes." He shuddered, unable to describe them further. Before anyone could respond, the door to the execution chamber slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the room, shaking the very walls. "What the—" Lucy started, but her words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the corridors. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was one of pure, unfiltered agony. The group stood frozen, their flashlights flickering in unison. The air grew impossibly cold, and a deep, guttural laugh filled the room. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Ben grabbed Mia's hand. "Stay close. We're getting out of here." As they moved toward the door, the shadows in the room began to shift. They weren't just dark. They were alive, writhing like black smoke. From the corner of her eye, Mia saw faces in the shadows. Twisted, anguished faces mouthing silent screams. "Don't look at them," she cried, pulling Ben forward. But it was too late. Lucy had already turned her gaze to the shadows. Her flashlight clattered to the floor as she froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Lucy, snap out of it," Jake yelled, shaking her. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. Tears streamed down her face as she pointed toward the electric chair. The group turned, and their blood ran cold. Sitting in the chair was the hooded figure Jake had seen earlier. It was impossibly tall, its long fingers gripping the armrests. The blade rested across its lap, gleaming with an unnatural light. Its hood tilted upward, revealing those same burning red eyes. "You do not belong here," it said, its voice a low growl that shook the room. The group staggered through the darkened halls, the air growing colder with every step. The walls seemed to close in, oozing with decades of grime and etched with scratch marks, a silent testament to countless inmates' desperation. Lucy gripped Mia's arm tightly, her flashlight beam trembling as she swept it across the corridor. The once muted murmurs from earlier now escalated into a cacophony of distant screams, sobbing, and laughter, echoing as though the walls themselves were alive. Jake led the way, his jaw clenched and shoulders stiff, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't feel. "What is this place?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the ghostly wails. Ben turned, his face pale. "Not just a prison, it's a damn mausoleum." The hall opened up into a cavernous chamber. The room was dominated by ancient, rusted iron chains hanging from the ceiling. their ends sharpened like jagged hooks. The ground beneath them was damp, stained with centuries of blood that glistened unnaturally in their flashlight beams. As they moved deeper inside, Lucy stepped on something soft and recoiled with a scream. It was a decayed skeletal hand, still clutching a rusted shiv. "I can't do this! We have to go back!" Lucy cried, backing away toward the hallway. But the hallway was gone, or rather, it had transformed. Where they had just walked was now a solid brick wall. Jake banged his fists against the stone, his breath coming in panicked gasps. "It's changing! The damn place is changing on us!" The shadows along the chamber's edge thickened, twisting and spiraling into humanoid shapes. One figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly, and whispered a name. Lucy ... Her blood ran cold. She grabbed Jake's arm, her nails digging in. "It knows my name," she hissed, her voice trembling. Before Jake could respond, the chains hanging from the ceiling began to swing. Slowly at first, then violently, clanging together like a symphony of menace. The shadowy figure lunged at Lucy, its icy touch gripping her arm and pulling her toward the chains. She screamed, flailing desperately, as the rest of the group scrambled to free her. Jake grabbed Lucy's other arm, yelling, "Pull her back!" The shadows seemed to laugh, their guttural chuckles reverberating through the chamber. Ben swung a loose pipe at the figure, but it passed through the entity as if striking smoke. Instead of dissipating, the shadow intensified, its form solidifying into a grotesque caricature of a human with hollow gaping eyes and a lipless mouth. "The executioner comes for those who trespass," it croaked, its voice a blend of gravel and malice. Suddenly, the chains wrapped around Lucy's legs, yanking her into the air. The others grabbed hold of her, engaging in a tug-of-war with the spectral forces. The sound of snapping bones echoed as one of the skeletal corpses on the floor began to rise, its jaws opening and closing with sickening clicks. Finally, with one last desperate pull, the group freed Lucy, sending them all tumbling to the ground. The shadows retreated momentarily, their glowing eyes watching from a distance. "This place is alive," Mia panted, holding her chest. Jake's flashlight caught the glint of something on the far side of the room, a massive iron door with intricate carvings depicting scenes of execution. Figures were lined up to meet a hooded man with a massive axe. "The executioner's chamber," Jake murmured, moving toward it. The carvings seemed to shift as he approached, the figures screaming silently in protest. Ben and Lucy followed hesitantly, while Mia lingered, staring back into the shadows. She swore she saw them move closer. The door creaked open with agonizing slowness, revealing a circular room dominated by a raised platform. At the center was a blood-stained execution block, and hanging above it was the executioner's axe. The weapon was enormous, its blade jagged and blackened, as if forged from darkness itself. Surrounding the platform were flickering candles, their flames unnaturally high and bright. Ben's voice cracked as he spoke. "This is where it happened. Every death, every execution. All of it." The candles suddenly extinguished, plunging the group into darkness. A deep, guttural laugh filled the room, followed by heavy footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You dare enter my domain?" a voice bellowed, shaking the very walls. The executioner materialized atop the platform, his hooded figure towering over them. His axe was in his hand now, its edge glinting menacingly despite the lack of light. Jake stepped forward, his hands trembling, but fists clenched. "We're not afraid of you," the executioner laughed, the sound like grinding stones. "Fear? No, it is not fear I crave. It is justice." He swung his axe in a wide arc, the motion sending a gust of freezing air through the room. "For centuries I have punished the guilty, and the guilty remain." The shadows that had stalked them poured into the room, circling the group like wolves preparing to attack. Each figure seemed to whisper something incomprehensible, but their tone was one of pure hatred. Lucy clung to Jake, her nails digging into his arm. "What do we do? We can't fight him!" Jake's eyes darted to the executioner's axe. "Maybe we don't have to fight him. Maybe we take his power." Ben stared at Jake as if he'd lost his mind. "You want to steal the axe? That thing will kill us before we get close." But Jake wasn't listening. He broke away from the group, sprinting toward the platform. The shadows lunged at him, their icy fingers grasping at his limbs. But he pushed through, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The executioner roared, raising his axe high. Jake leapt onto the platform, tackling the executioner with a force that surprised even himself. The axe flew from the executioner's hands, landing with a heavy thud. "Grab it!" Jake screamed, struggling against the executioner's overwhelming strength. Ben ran forward, snatching up the axe. The weapon was almost too heavy to lift, its handle burning cold against his skin. He swung it at the shadows and they recoiled, shrieking. Lucy and Mia joined him, using whatever they could find to keep the shadows at bay. Jake, still grappling with the executioner, shouted, "Destroy it! Break the damn thing!" Ben raised the axe high, slamming it against the execution block. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that shook the entire prison. The axe shattered, its shards glowing with an eerie blue light before fading into nothingness. The executioner let out a final, bone-chilling scream, his body dissolving into smoke. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive cold lifted. The group stood in silence, the room now empty and still. Jake collapsed onto the platform, gasping for breath. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded weakly. "Yeah, it's over." As they made their way out of the prison, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The storm outside had calmed, and the first rays of dawn pierced through the broken windows. But as they stepped into the sunlight, Lucy glanced back one last time. In the window of the executioner's chamber, a faint red glow flickered. Just for a moment, the group stumbled through the shattered remnants of the prison, their nerves frayed and breaths shallow. Despite the destruction of the axe and the apparent dissolution of the executioner, an unshakable feeling of dread lingered. The corridors seemed unnaturally long, and the distant wails of the storm outside grew louder as though the prison itself were alive, amplifying its chaos. Jake led the way, his flashlight flickering erratically. He tightened his grip on the handle, his knuckles white. "Let's keep moving. This place, it's not done with us." Suddenly, the walls began to tremble, a low rumbling vibrating through the floor. The faint red glow they had seen in the executioner's chamber now radiated through the cracks in the walls, pulsing like a heartbeat. Lucy clutched Mia's arm. "I thought we ended this. What's happening now?" Mia's face was pale. "We didn't destroy the curse. We only shattered its vessel. The power, it's still here." Behind them, the bricks began to dislodge, falling like pieces of a puzzle unraveling. From the rubble emerged a towering figure cloaked in shadow. It wasn't the executioner, but something more primal, more ancient. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence. The figure spoke, its voice like grinding stones. "You thought you could end my reign. You are mere trespassers in my dominion. The axe was but an extension of my will." The shadow surged toward them, its tendrils lashing out. Jake pushed Lucy aside just as one wrapped around his arm, yanking him into the air. He screamed as the tendril burned into his skin, leaving blackened marks. "Run!" Jake shouted, thrashing against the grip. "Get out of here!" But Ben wasn't running. He looked around wildly, his eyes settling on an old rusted generator in the corner of the room. "Electricity!" he yelled. "It's how they kept things in line before. Maybe we can contain it." The group scrambled to help. Mia and Lucy began dragging wires from the generator, while Jake continued to fight the shadow. Each second felt like an eternity as the entity's tendrils lashed out, smashing through walls and narrowly missing them. "Start it!" Jake bellowed, his voice hoarse. Ben slammed his fist into the start button, and the generator roared to life. Sparks flew as Lucy and Mia connected the wires, creating an electric barrier between the shadow and the group. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, recoiling from the barrier as it crackled with energy. The group huddled near the generator, panting and bloodied. But the shadow didn't dissipate. Instead, it began to reform, its edges solidifying into the familiar figure of the executioner. Mia's eyes widened in realization. It's not just the axe or the prison, the curse. It's tied to something deeper. We have to find its source. Jake, still clutching his injured arm, nodded. The records room. There were files back there. Maybe, maybe there's something that can tell us how this all started. With the shadow temporarily contained, the group sprinted back through the corridors. The prison seemed to fight them every step of the way. Doors slammed shut, walls shifted, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. Finally, they reached the records room. The space was in shambles, papers scattered and cabinets overturned. Ben frantically sifted through files while Lucy and Mia kept watch. "Here!" Ben shouted, holding up a crumbling document. It says the executioner wasn't just a man, he was part of a ritual, a sacrifice to an ancient entity that demanded blood. Mia read over his shoulder. The entity thrives on fear and death. It's bound to this place because of the rituals. To break the curse, we have to destroy its anchor. The group looked at each other, the weight of the task sinking in. The document detailed that the anchor was hidden in the deepest part of the prison, buried beneath the executioner's chamber. They retraced their steps, each hallway feeling more oppressive than the last. The shadow followed them, now more enraged than ever. It clawed at the walls, its voice booming. "You cannot escape!" They reached a hidden trapdoor in the chamber, prying it open to reveal a staircase spiraling into darkness. Jake led the way, his flashlight barely illuminating the damp, crumbling walls. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small room containing a grotesque altar. Bones and rotted flesh littered the floor, and at the center was a pulsating black orb, emanating waves of malevolence. The orb seemed to writhe as if alive, tendrils of darkness lashing out whenever they approached. "That's it," Mia whispered. "That's what's keeping the curse alive." As they stepped closer, the shadow entity materialized, its form now enormous and monstrous. "You dare to destroy me!" it roared. "You will die like all the others!" The group fought desperately, using anything they could find to fend off the creature's attacks. Jake grabbed a fallen piece of rebar and swung it at the orb, but the tendrils wrapped around him, throwing him across the room. Ben and Lucy worked together to rig a makeshift explosive, using the generator wires and chemicals they had found in the storage rooms earlier. "We need to overload the orb," Ben shouted. Jake, battered and bleeding, crawled toward the orb, using his last ounce of strength to distract the shadow. "Come on, you bastard! Is that all you've got?" The shadow lunged at him, leaving the orb exposed. Ben and Lucy connected the final wires, and the generator roared to life. Sparks flew as the orb began to crack, its dark energy leaking out in tendrils of smoke. "Everyone, get back!" Ben yelled, pulling Jake away from the altar. With a deafening explosion, the orb shattered. The room was consumed in blinding light, and the shadow let out a final, agonized scream before disintegrating into nothingness. The group emerged from the prison just as the sun rose. The building behind them was now eerily silent, its oppressive presence gone. The weight on their chests lifted, and for the first time in hours, they could breathe freely. Jake turned to the others, his face haggard but relieved. "It's over. For real this time." Mia looked back at the crumbling structure. "But how many others didn't make it out? This place, it's a graveyard," Ben nodded. "We'll make sure no one else sets foot in there again." As they walked away, the camera Lucy had brought to document the night flickered to life. The screen showed a faint red glow emanating from the prison windows just for a moment, before going dark. The curse was broken, but something lingered. Blackstone Penitentiary was a place time had tried to forget. Built in the late 1800s, the imposing structure was designed to house the most dangerous criminals society wanted to bury alive. Over the decades, it earned a reputation as more than just a prison. It was a living hell. Stories of torture, riots, and mysterious deaths painted its history in blood. But none were as infamous as the tale of Henry Larch, the cannibal inmate of Cell 37. Henry Larch was no ordinary man, even before he became Blackstone's most infamous resident. Born into poverty, Henry had an abusive childhood that left him broken and volatile. He developed an unnerving fascination with death, often dissecting stray animals and keeping their bones as trophies. His descent into full-blown monstrosity came as no surprise to those who knew him. Over a 3-year killing spree, Henry abducted and murdered 8 people, leaving behind no traces except for the occasional pile of picked clean bones. When he was finally caught, Henry showed no remorse. In court, he boasted about his crimes, saying, "Meat is meat, whether it walks on four legs or two." His chilling grin and dead eyes haunted everyone in the courtroom. The judge, visibly shaken, sentenced him to life in Blackstone Penitentiary, a punishment some considered too lenient. At Blackstone, Henry thrived. The prison's brutal environment was a fertile ground for his twisted tendencies. Guards reported finding mutilated rats and pigeons in his cell, their bones meticulously arranged in grotesque patterns. Fellow inmates avoided him, spreading rumors that Henry didn't just kill for sport, he killed because he was hungry. The turning point in Henry's legacy came during the infamous prison riot of 1978. What started as a protest over poor food rations spiraled into chaos when inmates overpowered the guards. Fires broke out, and the solitary confinement wing, where the most dangerous prisoners were housed, became ground zero for bloodshed. Henry, locked in cell 37, was cut off from the carnage at first. But as the riot stretched into days, food supplies dwindled, and the prison descended into anarchy. The guards abandoned the lower levels, leaving the inmates to fend for themselves. Screams echoed through the concrete halls, mixing with the sickening smell of burning flesh and sewage. When the guards finally regained control of the prison after 3 days, they ventured into the solitary wing. What they found was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Most of the prisoners were dead, their bodies mangled and partially eaten. Henry was the sole survivor, sitting calmly in the corner of his cell. His face and hands were smeared with blood, and he gnawed on what appeared to be a human rib. The guards recoiled in horror, but Henry only smiled. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice eerily calm. They weren't using it anymore. After the riot, Blackstone's administrators ordered cell 37 to be sealed indefinitely. They claimed it was to preserve evidence, but the guards knew the truth. There was something wrong with that cell. Even after Henry's death weeks later, his presence lingered. Guards on night shifts reported hearing guttural growls and scratching sounds from the sealed cell. Some claimed to see shadowy figures moving behind the rusted bars, even though the cell had been empty for years. One guard, tasked with clearing out the solitary wing, quit his job after entering cell 37. He described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if unseen eyes were watching his every move. He also reported a stench so foul it made him vomit, despite the room being empty of any organic matter. "It's like death itself lives in that cell," he said before disappearing from the public eye. The prison officially shut down in 1985, leaving Blackstone to rot. But cell 37 remained untouched, a shrine to Henry Larch's legacy. Locals whispered that anyone who dared enter the cell would come out marked, scratched, bitten, or worse. Paranormal investigators flocked to Blackstone over the years, drawn by the macabre legend. Some left with chilling stories, while others refused to speak about their experiences. Fast forward to the present, and Blackstone Penitentiary had become a magnet for thrill seekers. Urban explorers, ghost hunters, and adrenaline junkies all wanted a piece of its haunted reputation. Nathan, a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator, was no exception. He'd spent years chasing ghost stories, documenting his adventures on YouTube, and racking up views from curious onlookers. When Nathan heard about Cell 37, he knew he had to see it for himself. "This isn't just a haunted cell," he told his girlfriend Sarah, and their friends Chris and Danielle as they planned the trip. "This is the kind of place where legends are born." Sarah was skeptical. "You realize people have died in there, right? Like horribly." "That's exactly why we're going," Nathan said, grinning. "This could be the video that blows up our channel." Despite her reservations, Sarah agreed to join. Chris and Danielle, always up for a thrill, needed little convincing. The group set out for Blackstone on a chilly autumn night, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a Ouija board for added flair. They stopped at a diner on the way, where they met a grizzled old man who warned them against going. "You kids don't know what you're messing with," he said, his voice trembling. "That place isn't just haunted, it's cursed. Cell 37 isn't just a story, it's a trap." Nathan laughed it off. "Every ghost story has its skeptics," he said, earning a glare from Sarah. As they approached the prison, the air grew colder, and a heavy fog settled over the road. The towering silhouette of Blackstone came into view. its broken windows and crumbling facade making it look like a monster rising from the earth. Sarah shivered as they parked the car and approached the gates, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown gravel path. "This is it," Nathan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The birthplace of Henry Larch's legend." The group stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The prison seemed to breathe around them, its empty halls whispering secrets of pain and suffering. And as they ventured deeper, towards the solitary wing in cell 37, they felt the weight of the prison's history pressing down on them. The air inside Blackstone Penitentiary was thick with decay and silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on shattered glass and debris. Each corridor seemed to stretch infinitely, illuminated only by the beams of their flashlights that barely penetrated the suffocating darkness. The walls were stained with the ghosts of time, graffiti, rust, and the remnants of crude messages scratched by desperate hands. Nathan led the group confidently, his camera recording every step. He narrated in a hushed tone, weaving stories about the prison's grim history. "This place was built for suffering," he said, his voice echoing ominously. "They didn't just lock people away, they made sure they felt every second of their punishment." Sarah stayed close behind, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The stories about Blackstone had unsettled her from the start, but now, standing in the belly of this beast, she felt something deeper, an almost primal fear that she couldn't shake. "Guys, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This place feels wrong." Chris, ever the jokester, chuckled nervously. "Come on, Sarah. What's the worst that could happen? Ghosts don't bite." Danielle, holding the Ouija board under her arm, smirked. "Tell that to Henry Larch. Didn't he literally eat people?" As if summoned by the mention of his name, a faint scratching sound echoed from somewhere deep within the prison. Everyone froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the kind of noise that didn't belong in an abandoned building. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around. Nathan raised a hand, signaling for silence. He listened intently, his camera pointed down the corridor. The scratching stopped, leaving only the oppressive stillness. "It's probably just a rat," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving. We're almost at the solitary wing." The group continued, their unease growing with each step. The corridors narrowed and the air grew colder, carrying with it a faint but unmistakable stench of decay. It wasn't just old rot. It was the kind of smell that clung to your skin, turning your stomach and making your eyes water. "Jesus," Chris muttered, covering his nose. "What the hell died in here?" No one answered. They reached a rusted metal door at the end of the corridor, its surface covered in deep scratches that looked almost deliberate. A faded sign above it read "Solitary Confinement," and beneath it, someone had scrawled in red paint, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter." Nathan pushed the door open, its hinges screaming in protest. The room beyond was a cavernous expanse of darkness, lined with rows of heavy steel doors. Each cell seemed to exude its own aura of despair, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the agony of the inmates who once lived and died there. "This is it," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cell 37 is somewhere down this hall." Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. "I don't think we should go in there," she said, her voice shaking. "This place, it feels alive." Danielle rolled her eyes. "Come on, Sarah. It's just an old prison. Don't let the spooky vibes get to you." But as they stepped into the solitary wing, even Danielle couldn't hide her discomfort. The air here was different, denser, heavier, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on them. And then came the whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. "Did you hear that?" Chris asked, spinning around with his flashlight. "Probably just the wind," Nathan said, though his face betrayed his doubt. "Let's find cell 37. Finding cell 37 was both easier and more horrifying than they expected. The door was unmistakable. Its metal surface was pitted and scarred, with deep gouges that looked like claw marks. The number 37 was painted in faded red, and beneath it, someone had scratched the words, "Feed me." The smell here was overwhelming, a nauseating blend of rot and something metallic, like blood. Sarah gagged, stepping back instinctively. "I can't do this," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "This place isn't right." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've come this far. Just a quick look inside and we're out. I promise." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed to leave. Nathan reached out and pushed the door, which creaked open with surprising ease, revealing the darkness within. He shone his flashlight inside, and the beam illuminated a scene of unspeakable horror. The cell was small, barely large enough to stand in, but its walls were covered in scratches and strange symbols, as if someone or something had tried to claw its way out. The floor was littered with bones, human bones, gnawed clean and scattered haphazardly. In the corner of the cell sat a crude altar made of skulls, arranged in a grotesque pyramid. "Holy shit," Chris whispered, his face pale. "This is insane." Nathan was already filming, his excitement palpable. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "This is what we came for." But as he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. The temperature plummeted, and the light from their flashlights flickered and dimmed. And then came the growl, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cell. "What the hell was that?" Danielle said, clutching the Ouija board like a shield. Before anyone could answer, the cell door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang, plunging them into near darkness. Panic set in as they pounded on the door, shouting for help. But the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to echo from all around them. Nathan's camera caught it first, a shadowy figure, impossibly tall and hunched, standing just beyond the cell door. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed jagged, razor-sharp teeth. "It's him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's Henry." The growl grew louder, reverberating through the prison like the echo of a wild beast prowling its territory. The shadowy figure outside cell 37 seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. Nathan's camera trembled in his hands as he tried to keep it steady, the red light of the recording blinking furiously. "Is that human?" Chris stammered, backing up against the wall, his face pale with terror. Before anyone could respond, the entity moved, impossibly fast, slamming its massive hand against the door. The entire cell seemed to quake under the impact, and for a moment, all they could hear was the deafening sound of metal bending. The flashlight beams danced wildly as the group scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Sarah let out a scream as the door to cell 37 flung open violently. But instead of escaping, they were thrown backward, as if some invisible force was pushing them deeper into the room. The air inside the cell grew thick and suffocating, the stench of decay intensifying to an unbearable degree. Danielle's Ouija board tumbled to the floor, landing face up. The planchette slid across the board, seemingly of its own accord, spelling out a single word: hunger. "Oh my God," Danielle whimpered, clutching her head. "It knows we're here. It wants—" She didn't get to finish. The cell door slammed shut again, trapping them inside. The growling was now a deafening roar coming from all around them. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, vibrating with the force of whatever malevolent spirit inhabited this place. Nathan aimed his camera at the cell's corner, where the pile of bones and skulls had been, but now the bones were moving. They rattled and shifted, assembling themselves into a grotesque shape. A skeletal figure began to rise, its eye sockets glowing with a sickly yellow light. "Run!" Nathan shouted, though there was nowhere to run. Chris lunged for the door, trying to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah clung to Danielle, tears streaming down her face as the skeletal figure took a step toward them, its jaw opening and closing in a mimicry of speech. "Feed me!" it rasped, its voice like the grinding of metal on bone. Suddenly, the room was plunged into complete darkness. The flashlights flickered and died, leaving only the glow of Nathan's camera to illuminate the horror unfolding around them. "Turn it off!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Don't let it see us!" But Nathan was frozen, his camera still trained on the entity as it reached out a bony hand. The smell of rot was overpowering now, making it hard to breathe. And then, As quickly as it had started, everything went silent. For a moment, the group dared to hope that it was over. But then they heard it, the wet, tearing sound of flesh being ripped apart. The silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. It took them a moment to realize it was coming from Chris. The glow from Nathan's camera revealed the horrific scene. Chris was pinned against the wall, the skeletal figure's bony fingers digging into his shoulder. Blood seeped from the wounds, staining the cell's floor. "Help me!" Chris cried, his voice breaking. Nathan dropped the camera in a panic, lunging toward Chris, but the skeletal figure turned its glowing eyes on him. With a guttural roar, it threw Chris across the cell like a rag doll. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and collapsed to the floor, motionless. "Chris!" Danielle screamed, rushing to his side. But as she reached out to him, the cell began to shake violently. The walls cracked, and the air was filled with the sound of distant screams, as if the souls of the prison's dead were crying out in unison. "We have to get out of here!" Nathan shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. "How? The door's locked!" Sarah sobbed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The skeletal figure advanced toward them, its movements jerky and unnatural. The symbols on the walls began to glow, casting the cell in an eerie red light. The word hunger burned itself into the door, the letters dripping as if written in blood. Danielle, still clutching the Ouija board, suddenly had an idea. "The board!" she screamed. "We have to use the board!" "Are you insane?" Nathan yelled, pulling Sarah behind him. "It's the only way," Danielle said, dropping to her knees. She placed her hands on the planchette, her fingers trembling. The others hesitated, but the skeletal figure let out another roar, and they had no choice. Nathan and Sarah joined Danielle, their hands trembling as they touched the board. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ask it what it wants," Danielle said. Nathan hesitated, then spoke. "What do you want from us?" The planchette moved instantly, sliding across the board with unnatural speed. It spelled out FLESH. "We don't have anything to give it," Sarah cried. The figure lunged toward them, and the group screamed. But then Danielle had an idea. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, a gift from her father, and sliced her palm open. Blood dripped onto the board, and the skeletal figure froze. The planchette moved again, spelling out, "Enough!" The red light faded, and the cell door creaked open. Without hesitation, the group bolted, dragging Chris's unconscious body with them. The prison seemed to come alive as they ran, the walls groaning and the floor shaking beneath their feet. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for air under the pale moonlight. The prison was silent once more, its dark silhouette looming behind them. Chris stirred, groaning in pain. "What happened?" he muttered. Nathan didn't answer. He looked back at the prison, clutching his camera tightly. On the screen, the last thing it had recorded was the skeletal figure standing in the doorway of cell 37, its glowing eyes watching them leave. "Let's go," Nathan said, his voice hollow. "We're never coming back here." As they walked away, none of them noticed the faint growl that followed them into the night. Black Hollow Penitentiary, ominously nicknamed Hell's Gate by the locals, loomed on the edge of an overgrown forest like a forgotten relic of despair. Built in 1875, its foreboding iron gates and towering, decaying walls seemed to trap not only the physical, but also the spiritual remnants of the horrors committed within. Over the decades, Black Hollow earned its fearsome reputation as a place where human rights were ignored, cruelty reigned supreme, and survival was a daily challenge. The most harrowing chapter of its history came in 1963, when a catastrophic riot turned the prison into a battlefield drenched in blood. Even decades after its closure, Black Hollow remained the subject of dark fascination. Urban explorers and ghost hunters, drawn by tales of spectral guards patrolling the corridors and disembodied screams echoing through the night, often dared to trespass. Most came back with harrowing accounts of shadowy figures and an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Others never returned, their disappearances chalked up to accidents or, as some believed, the wrath of vengeful spirits. For Tom and his team of paranormal investigators, Black Hollow represented the ultimate challenge. Known for their YouTube channel, Spectral Truths, the group had spent years chasing proof of the supernatural. While most of their investigations yielded little more than fleeting shadows and ambiguous audio clips, the stories surrounding Black Hollow promised something different, something undeniably real. The stakes were high, and so was their determination to uncover the truth behind the tales of the riot that never ended. Tom, the group's leader, was the quintessential adventurer, his bold nature tempered by an insatiable curiosity. Sarah, the historian, brought depth to their explorations with her meticulous research into each location's past. Matt, the tech-savvy member, was responsible for the cutting-edge equipment that gave their investigations a scientific edge. Dana, the sensitive medium, often bridged the gap between the living and the dead, her insights both a blessing and a curse. Then there was Eric, the skeptic, who joined more for the thrill than a belief in the supernatural. Their journey to Black Hollow began with weeks of preparation. Sarah unearthed disturbing records of the prison's history, reports of inhumane treatment, unsanctioned executions, and the brutal 1963 riot that left over 300 dead. This wasn't just a prison, Sarah explained during one of their planning sessions. It was a slaughterhouse. The guards treated the inmates like animals, and when they rebelled, it was a bloodbath. The warden ordered his men to restore order at all costs, and they did, with guns, batons, and tear gas. The inmates fought back with stolen weapons, fire, and sheer desperation. By the end, the prison was littered with corpses. They say the warden was among the dead, but his body was never recovered. Dana, seated across from Sarah, shivered despite the warmth of the room. No wonder the energy there is so dark, so much pain and anger. It's like the riot never ended. It's trapped in a loop, playing out again and again. Eric, lounging with a beer in hand, rolled his eyes. Or maybe it's just a bunch of stories to scare people off. Abandoned places are creepy. That's it. Ghosts don't exist. Tom leaned forward, his excitement barely contained. We'll find out soon enough. If there's even a shred of truth to the stories, this could be our biggest investigation yet. The drive to Black Hollow was uneventful, but filled with nervous energy. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees whose gnarled branches seemed to reach for the van like skeletal hands. When the penitentiary finally came into view, its looming structure seemed to swallow the fading sunlight, casting long, sinister shadows. They parked near the crumbling main gate. A rusted no trespassing sign dangled precariously from a chain, creaking in the breeze. Matt began unloading the equipment: thermal cameras, EMF detectors, motion sensors, and a state-of-the-art audio recorder capable of capturing frequencies beyond human hearing. "Ready?" Tom asked, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. "As I'll ever be," Sarah replied, clutching her notebook and flashlight. Eric smirked. "Let's go meet some ghosts, or not." The group passed through the gates, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, and the once mighty structure was a skeleton of its former self. Yet as they approached the entrance, an inexplicable chill washed over them. Inside, the air was stifling, carrying the metallic tang of rust. Or was it blood? The walls were covered in graffiti, but beneath the layers of spray paint, faded messages from the prisoners remained. One read, "Hell is here." Dana stopped abruptly, her face pale. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's watching us?" Eric asked, his tone mocking, but his eyes betraying a flicker of apprehension. "The ones who never left," Dana replied. Tom led the way down the main hallway, the beam of his flashlight revealing decaying cells. Inmates' belongings, untouched for decades, littered the floors. Torn books, rusted tin cups, and a child's drawing pinned to a wall. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air became. A faint sound began to echo. At first a distant murmur, then distinct voices. The group stopped, their breath caught in their throats. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. It was the unmistakable sound of shouting, followed by the clang of metal against metal. "It's just the wind," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. Dana shook her head. "It's them. The riot, it's starting." Suddenly the sound of a gunshot rang out. so loud and real that the group instinctively ducked. The noise was followed by blood-curdling screams and the sound of boots running on concrete. "Stay together," Tom ordered, his voice firm despite the panic threatening to take hold. As they turned a corner, they came face to face with a figure, a man in a guard's uniform, his face twisted in fear and rage. Before they could react, the figure dissipated like smoke, leaving behind the echo of his anguished cries. "Welcome to Hell's Gate," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The group pressed on, their nerves fraying with each step. The prison seemed alive, its walls pulsating with anger and sorrow. And deep within its heart, the riot waited, ready to ensnare them in its never-ending chaos. The deeper the group delved into Black Hollow Penitentiary, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every step seemed heavier than the last, as if the building itself were trying to resist their intrusion. The narrow corridors were lined with rusted cell bars, some of which appeared to have been torn open by inhuman force. Shadows danced along the walls, their origins unclear, making it impossible to tell whether they were mere tricks of the light or something far more sinister. Dana froze suddenly, clutching her head as if struck by an invisible force. "They're screaming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of tension. "What are you talking about?" Eric asked, his skepticism faltering as he noticed her trembling hands. "They're screaming, begging for help. It's like they're trapped in a nightmare they can't escape," Dana continued, tears streaming down her face. Tom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. Just stay with us." The group entered what had once been the cafeteria, a cavernous room filled with overturned tables and rusted metal trays scattered across the floor. The stench of decay was overwhelming, making them gag. Suddenly, the faint sounds of laughter and clinking trays began to echo through the room. Matt quickly set up his audio recorder and motion sensors. "This is incredible. These voices, they're residual. We're hearing echoes of the past." As they moved further in, the laughter abruptly turned to shouts of anger. The temperature plummeted, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room. Then came the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Tom instinctively ducked, dragging Sarah and Dana with him. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's the riot," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We're caught in a replay of the riot." Eric stood frozen, his face pale as a shadowy figure lunged toward him, its form dissolving into mist just before reaching him. "Did you see that?" he stammered. "Tell me someone saw that." "We need to keep moving," Tom said, his voice firm. "Stay close and don't lose sight of each other." The group pressed on, entering the infirmary. The room was eerily silent, its walls stained with what looked like decades-old blood. Rusted surgical tools were strewn across counters, and the skeletal remains of a stretcher lay in the center. Dana let out a gasp and pointed to the corner. There, hunched over what appeared to be a pile of rags, was a translucent figure of a nurse. Her head snapped up, revealing hollow eye sockets and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. She reached out a skeletal hand before vanishing into thin air. "What was that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "The nurse," Sarah replied, flipping through her notes. "During the riot, she was trapped here with dozens of injured inmates. The guards locked the doors and left them to die. She tried to save them, but there was no way out." As they left the infirmary, the group found themselves in the heart of the prison, the cell block where the riot had begun. The air was thick with tension, and the distant sounds of chaos grew louder with every step. The cells, once home to some of the most dangerous criminals, seemed to pulse with malevolence. Matt set up another motion sensor near one of the cells, its interior pitch black despite the light from his flashlight. As he adjusted the camera, the cell door slammed shut with a deafening clang, trapping him inside. "Matt!" Sarah screamed, rushing to the door. "I can't open it!" Tom shouted, pulling at the rusted bars with all his strength. Inside, Matt's flashlight flickered, revealing dozens of shadowy figures surrounding him. Their faces were contorted with rage and despair, their mouths moving silently as they reached for him. "Get me out of here!" Matt yelled, his voice filled with panic. Dana stepped forward, her hands outstretched. "Leave him alone!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the block. The figures hesitated, their forms wavering before disappearing altogether. The cell door creaked open, and Matt stumbled out, his face pale and drenched in sweat. They, they were everywhere, he stammered. I could feel them touching me, pulling me. We need to get out of here, Eric said, his earlier bravado replaced with genuine fear. No, Tom said firmly. We've come this far. We can't leave without understanding what's happening here. Sarah pointed to a staircase leading down. The record said the warden's office is in the basement. If there are answers, they'll be there. The group descended into the darkness, unaware that the riot wasn't just a memory. They were becoming a part of it. The line between the living and the dead blurred, and the riot's fury, undiminished by time, awaited them below. The investigators, shaken but determined, regrouped in the prison's central cell block, a vast, eerie chamber lined with rusted bars. The temperature dropped drastically, and their breaths now formed ghostly clouds. Kevin suggested they review their findings and possibly leave, but Nina, driven by her insatiable curiosity, insisted they go further, especially to the warden's office. The team's lanterns flickered more erratically as they walked through the cell block. Above, the catwalk creaked as if someone were pacing. The rhythmic clink of what sounded like boots on metal sent chills down their spines. "Who's there?" Kevin shouted. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving the group in an oppressive silence. Suddenly, the clang of cell doors echoed through the chamber. One by one, the doors to the empty cells slammed shut with deafening force. The noise was relentless, growing louder until it felt like the entire prison was alive with rage. Nina screamed as she saw a shadowy figure rush past her peripheral vision, disappearing into one of the locked cells. "Stop! Everyone just stop moving!" Derek yelled, his voice shaking. The noise ceased as quickly as it had begun, but now ghostly whispers surrounded them, echoing faintly through the chamber. The whispers grew louder, morphing into anguished cries. From the corner of her eye, Nina spotted movement inside one of the cells. Against her better judgment, she peered inside and gasped. There, crouched in the darkness, was the silhouette of an emaciated prisoner. His hollow eyes glowed faintly as he whispered, "They're coming. We're all trapped. Forever." Before she could react, the figure vanished, leaving only a scrawled message on the wall that hadn't been there moments earlier. No escape. The team hurried toward the warden's office, but the path was a labyrinth of shadows. Every turn seemed to lead them back to the central block. Their growing panic was palpable. "This place is screwing with us," Derek muttered. At last, they found the staircase leading to the warden's office. The ascent felt endless, with every creak of the stairs accompanied by distant cries and moans. When they finally reached the office, they found the door slightly ajar. Inside, it was as though time had stopped. Dusty ledgers and papers were scattered across the desk, and a decayed chair sat behind it. On the wall hung a portrait of the warden, his cold eyes staring straight ahead. Kevin approached the desk cautiously, flipping open a ledger. The entries detailed prisoner transfers, punishments, and a chilling line repeated over and over in the warden's handwriting. "Order must be maintained, at any cost." As Nina examined the room, she felt drawn to a corner where a strange dark stain marred the floor. It was sticky, as though the blood had never dried. "This is where it happened," she whispered, her voice trembling. The warden had been killed during the riot, dragged into his office and beaten to death by inmates. The energy in the room was heavy with rage and despair. Just as Kevin suggested leaving, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lanterns went out, plunging the room into total darkness. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. "What the hell is that?" Derek shouted. The growl morphed into laughter, low, guttural, and full of malice. The portrait on the wall seemed to shift, the warden's painted eyes now following their every movement. Suddenly, the desk flew across the room, slamming into the wall with inhuman force. Ghostly figures began to materialize, inmates locked in perpetual torment. They clawed at their phantom restraints, their faces contorted in silent screams. Amid the chaos, the warden's spectral figure appeared, towering over the group. His ghostly presence radiated authority and terror. "Order must be maintained," he bellowed, his voice shaking the walls. His translucent hands reached for Kevin, who froze in terror. Nina grabbed a broken chair leg and swung it through the apparition, but it passed harmlessly through. The warden laughed again, his form flickering like a bad projection. "You've entered my domain. There is no leaving," he declared, his voice dripping with venom. The room dissolved around them, and they found themselves back in the central cell block, surrounded by the howling spirits of prisoners and guards alike. The prison seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy as the team found themselves back in the central cell block. The walls seemed closer than before, the shadows darker, and the air heavier with the weight of something unseen yet palpable. Kevin tried to calm everyone, but his voice was shaky, betraying his fear. "We just need to stick together and find a way out. This place is trying to divide us." But it was already too late. The echoes of distant gunfire and the clanging of bars reverberated through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, the cell doors that lined the block slammed open in unison, the sound piercing and jarring. Out of the shadows, ghostly figures began to emerge, prisoners and guards alike, their spectral bodies bearing the wounds of their violent deaths. The prisoners had ghostly shackles dangling from their wrists, while the guards held their phantom weapons, their faces locked in expressions of terror or rage. The team huddled together in the center of the block, watching in horror as the spirits began to reenact the riot. The prisoners lunged at the guards, spectral chains being used as weapons, while the guards retaliated with their nightsticks and firearms. The riot unfolded in terrifying detail, the screams of the dead echoing as blood, both real and ghostly, splattered across the cell block. Yet despite the chaos, some of the spirits turned their attention toward the living intruders. One prisoner, his face half melted from what seemed like a fire, lunged at Derek, his ghostly hands passing through Derek's chest. Derek screamed in agony, clutching his heart as though it had been scorched. Nina grabbed Derek and tried to pull him away, but the prisoner's grip seemed to drag Derek closer. With a desperate swing, Kevin used the crowbar he'd brought and struck the phantom figure. It dissolved into a black mist, but Derek fell to his knees, gasping for air. I saw it," Derek wheezed. "I saw how he died, burned alive in the cafeteria." Before they could catch their breath, the warden's voice boomed through the cell block once more. "You've trespassed on sacred ground. You will bear witness to the order I restored, and you will suffer as they did." The air around them grew icy, their breaths visible in the dim light. The warden's figure began to materialize again, this time in the center of the cell block. He carried a ghostly baton, its surface dripping with blood. His eyes glowed with a haunting light as he pointed at the team. "Choose among yourselves. One of you stays with me forever." The team exchanged horrified glances as the warden's words sank in. "What do you mean, one of us?" Nina demanded, her voice trembling. But the warden offered no response. Instead, the riot around them intensified, the ghostly violence spilling over into their space. The team scrambled as ghostly prisoners and guards clashed around them, their screams almost drowning out the warden's commands. Kevin tried to take control. "We're not choosing anyone. We stick together and find a way out." But the prison had other plans. The ground beneath their feet began to quake, and a fissure opened in the center of the cell block. From it rose a fiery glow, accompanied by the stench of burning flesh. The warden stepped closer, his ghostly form towering over the group. "Defy me, and you'll all stay here." Before anyone could respond, Derek screamed. The burn marks on his chest began to glow, and his body was yanked toward the fissure. Nina grabbed him, but the force was too strong. Kevin and Amanda joined in, pulling Derek back with all their strength. The warden laughed, his voice reverberating like thunder. "Fate has chosen him." But Nina refused to let go. She pulled the journal from her bag, frantically flipping through its pages. "There has to be something in here," she shouted. Finally, she found a passage that mentioned a ritual to banish the warden's spirit. The instructions were cryptic, but it involved burning an item that belonged to him and reciting an incantation. "The portrait!" Nina yelled. "We need to burn his portrait!" Amanda and Kevin ran back to the warden's office while Nina and Derek tried to hold off the warden's ghostly form. The warden, sensing their plan, sent his spectral minions after the duo. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as Amanda and Kevin sprinted, dodging apparitions and debris that seemed to fall from the crumbling ceiling. They reached the office, only to find the portrait glowing ominously, as if it were alive. Kevin grabbed it, but the moment he touched the frame, he was thrown across the room by an unseen force. Amanda, determined, picked up a rusted lighter from the desk and set the edge of the portrait on fire. The flames consumed it quickly, but the warden's voice screamed in fury, shaking the entire prison. Back in the cell block, the warden faltered, his form flickering. Nina recited the incantation from the journal, her voice rising above the cacophony of the riot. The fissure in the ground began to close, and the spectral figures dissolved into the air. The warden let out one final, earth-shaking roar before disappearing in a burst of light. The team stood in stunned silence as the prison fell eerily quiet. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. They made their way to the exit, their steps quick and determined. As they stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. But just as they thought it was over, Nina glanced back at the prison. In one of the shattered windows, she saw the faint outline of the warden, his glowing eyes fixed on her. A cold shiver ran down her spine as his voice echoed in her mind. "You can't escape forever." The team drove away, vowing never to return, but they knew the prison's curse would never truly be lifted. Fairfield Penitentiary loomed over the surrounding countryside like a monolith of despair. The structure, built in the early 20th century, had long since been abandoned. Yet it held a grip over the imagination of locals and thrill-seekers alike. Its reputation for violence, misery, and unexplained phenomena had turned it into a legend, a place whispered about around campfires and featured in sensationalist ghost hunting shows. Yet of all its dark legends, none were as infamous as the tale of Cell 27, the Weeping Cell. The penitentiary itself was a sprawling complex of decaying brick walls and rusted barbed wire, a monument to a bygone era of justice and punishment. The air around it always seemed colder, the wind carrying faint echoes of the anguished cries that had once reverberated through its halls. Locals avoided it, not just out of fear, but from a collective acknowledgement that Fairfield was a place best left to rot in silence. Cell 27 was deep within the solitary confinement wing, a segment of the prison designed to break the minds of its inhabitants. Solitary was already a place of torment, but Cell 27 seemed to have been born of malice. Its history revolved around one inmate, Victor Shears, a man so vile that even the hardened criminals who shared the prison with him whispered his name in disgust and fear. Victor had been convicted of unspeakable crimes against children, acts so heinous that even the guards treated him with open contempt. Victor wasn't just infamous for his crimes, he was a presence that unsettled everyone around him. He was unremarkable in appearance, average height, wiry build, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of something unnatural. Guards reported feeling a chill in his presence, as if the very air around him turned sour. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice carried an eerie calmness that unnerved even the most stoic of listeners. The records about Victor's time in Cell 27 were sparse, but the stories that emerged from the guards painted a picture of horror. He was known to spend hours scratching at the walls, muttering to himself in a language no one could recognize. One guard, a young recruit named Henry, claimed to have seen Victor speaking to the shadows in his cell as if carrying on a conversation. When questioned about it, Victor simply smiled and said, "They're waiting." The events leading up to Victor's death were the stuff of nightmares. One night, guards were alerted by the sound of frantic scratching and muffled screams coming from Cell 27. When they arrived, they found Victor crouched in a corner, his fingernails torn and bloody from clawing at the walls. He was babbling incoherently, his eyes wide with terror. He kept repeating, "The children are coming. They're here for me." The next morning, Victor was found dead in his cell. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, his face contorted into an expression of sheer terror. The cause of death was never determined, and the prison's warden at the time ordered the cell sealed off. After Victor's death, the phenomena associated with Cell 27 began to intensify. Guards reported hearing the sound of sobbing coming from the empty cell, followed by faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls. Some claimed to see claw-like marks appearing on the walls overnight, while others swore they felt unseen hands brushing against them as they walked past the cell. The most unsettling account came from a maintenance worker who entered the cell to inspect a leaking pipe. He emerged minutes later, pale and trembling, claiming he had seen Victor's shadow on the wall, even though the room was empty. The prison was eventually shut down in the 1980s, its infamy solidified by the countless stories of suffering and horror that had unfolded within its walls. But Cell 27 remained sealed, its secrets locked away. Locals believed the cell was cursed, and even in the decades after the prison's closure, no one dared to break the chains that bound its door. Yet, as is often the case with tales of horror, the legend of Cell 27 only grew with time. Paranormal investigators, urban explorers, and thrill seekers began to flock to Fairfield Penitentiary, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. But even the most daring among them avoided Cell 27. It was a place that exuded a sense of malevolence so palpable that even the bravest ghost hunters hesitated to approach it. This unspoken rule was about to be tested. A team of paranormal investigators, fueled by ambition and the lure of internet fame, had set their sights on Cell 27. They were determined to uncover its secrets, to capture evidence of the supernatural, and prove that the legends were more than just stories. They had no idea what awaited them in the depths of Fairfield Penitentiary. The leader of the team, Elena, was a seasoned investigator who had spent years chasing ghosts and unraveling paranormal mysteries. Her crew, Mike, the skeptical tech expert, Sarah, the psychic medium, and Jake, the cameraman, were equally experienced, though none of them could shake the unease they felt as they approached Fairfield. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as they stood at the entrance to the solitary confinement wing. Her voice wavered, and her normally confident demeanor was replaced by visible apprehension. Elena nodded, her determination unwavering. "This is what we came for. Cell 27 is the crown jewel of paranormal investigations. If there's anywhere we're going to find evidence, it's here." Jake adjusted his camera, trying to mask his own nervousness. "Let's just hope we don't end up as part of the legend." The team pushed forward, their footsteps echoing through the desolate corridors of the prison. The air grew colder as they neared the sealed door of Cell 27. The chains that bound it were rusted, but they seemed to radiate an almost tangible sense of foreboding. Sarah hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the door. She pulled back immediately, her face pale. It's not just sadness," she whispered. "It's pure evil." Mike, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "Evil or not, we're getting in there. Let's cut the chains and see what's inside." As the bolt cutter snapped through the chains, the door creaked open, revealing the dark interior of Cell 27. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in faint, jagged marks, scratches that seemed to shift and writhe under the flickering beam of their flashlights. And then, from the depths of the cell, came the unmistakable sound of sobbing. The air within Cell 27 seemed alive, pressing down on the group with a weight that was both physical and psychological. The sobbing sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a haunting silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Elena, holding her flashlight steady, stepped inside first, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Stick together," she whispered, her voice shaky despite her attempt at confidence. The cell was small, barely large enough to accommodate the four of them. The walls were covered in scratches that appeared to be layered upon each other, forming a chaotic tapestry of torment. Some of the marks resembled letters, though they were indecipherable, while others looked like claw marks, deep and jagged, as if made by something desperate or inhuman. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, clutching the edges of the doorframe as if an invisible force were pulling her back. "It's overwhelming," she said, her voice trembling. "The sadness, the anger. It's like it's alive." Mike snorted, though his bravado felt forced. "It's just a room, Sarah. Let's set up the equipment and get this over with." The team began unpacking their gear, setting up EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and digital recorders to capture any signs of the paranormal. Jake adjusted his camera to get a wide shot of the room, but as he peered through the viewfinder, his hands began to shake. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look at the corner." Elena turned her flashlight toward the far corner of the cell, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick. For a moment, it looked as if the darkness was moving, shifting ever so slightly. Then a faint outline began to take shape. A figure hunched over, rocking back and forth. The sobbing returned, louder now, echoing through the small cell. It was a heart-wrenching sound, filled with despair and something darker. Elena stepped back instinctively, her heart racing. "Is that Victor?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind an icy chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Sarah gasped, clutching her chest as if struggling to breathe. "They're here," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "The children, they're crying. They want us to leave." Mike rolled his eyes, though even he seemed unsettled. "It's just your imagination, Sarah. Let's focus on the equipment. Maybe we can get some actual proof instead of just jumping at shadows." As the group resumed their investigation, the cell seemed to come alive around them. The EMF detectors spiked erratically. The cameras captured strange orbs of light, and the digital recorders picked up faint whispers that none of them could understand. Elena reviewed the audio on one of the recorders, her face growing pale as she listened. "It's repeating the same thing," she said, holding out the recorder for the others to hear. The playback was faint but unmistakable. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Jake glanced toward the cell door, his instincts screaming at him to leave. "Maybe we should listen," he said, his voice barely audible. But Elena shook her head, her determination overriding her fear. "We're not leaving until we've uncovered the truth. We need to know what happened here." The group pressed on, unaware of the malevolent force that was beginning to awaken around them. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the cell grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The temperature dropped further, their breaths now forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The sobbing had given way to whispers, unintelligible, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all directions. Sarah sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes darting around the room. "They're watching us," she muttered. "They don't want us here." Mike, still trying to maintain his skepticism, pointed at the scratches on the walls. These could have been made by anyone. Prisoners losing their minds, animals, whoever. This isn't proof of anything supernatural. Elena turned to him, her expression stern. "Then explain the whispers. Explain the shadow we saw. Explain why the air feels like it's suffocating us." Before Mike could respond, the room was plunged into darkness. The flashlights flickered, then went out entirely, leaving the group in an impenetrable blackness. Jake fumbled with his camera, his voice shaking. "This isn't funny, Elena. What's going on?" A low growl echoed through the cell, sending a wave of fear through the group. It was guttural and animalistic, yet somehow human, a sound that shouldn't exist. The growl was followed by the sound of scratching, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from all around them. Sarah screamed as something cold and wet brushed against her arm. She scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the wall. "Something touched me," she cried. Elena reached out, trying to find her teammates in the darkness. "Everyone stay calm. We need to get the lights back on." As if in response to her words, a dim, flickering light illuminated the cell. It wasn't from their flashlights, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed like living creatures. In the center of the room, the shadowy figure of Victor Shears began to materialize once more. This time, he was not alone. Surrounding him were smaller, more indistinct figures. Children, their forms flickering like static on a broken television. Their faces were pale and featureless, but their presence was unmistakably tragic. Victor turned his hollow eyes toward the group, his mouth curling into a sinister smile. His voice was a raspy whisper, yet it filled the room. "You shouldn't have come here." The children began to move, their small ghostly hands reaching out toward the group. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of pain and anger. Jake dropped his camera and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. He pounded on the metal, his screams drowned out by the rising noise in the cell. Elena grabbed Sarah and Mike, pulling them into a corner. "We need to stay together," she shouted, though her voice was barely audible over the chaos. Victor stepped closer, his shadow stretching toward them like a living thing. "You will pay for what you've done," he hissed. The darkness inside the cell seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Each breath the group took felt colder, the air thick with dread. Elena's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes on her. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, their edges curling like clawed fingers reaching out toward them. Victor Shears, the former inmate whose terrifying presence filled the cell, stood at the center, surrounded by the flickering, ghostly forms of the children. The air was thick with sorrow and rage, a suffocating combination that seemed to cloud the very space around them. "You should never have come here," Victor's voice echoed. But it was no longer the voice of a man. It was guttural, rasping, as though each word was dragged from the depths of something ancient and predatory. His face, still partially obscured by the shadows, contorted into a grotesque, twisted grin. The smile was devoid of warmth, a pure expression of malevolence. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The vision of the children, their hollow eyes and twitching hands, sent waves of terror through her. The figures moved closer, their voices growing louder, overlapping into an incoherent buzz of whispers. "Leave! Leave!" they chanted, but their words carried a venomous edge, more like a command than a plea. Sarah, who had been silent for what felt like hours, finally broke down. She crumbled to the floor, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't stay here," she cried. "Please, we have to get out. They won't let us go." Mike, still reeling from the shock of seeing the ghostly children, staggered back. He reached for the door, only to find it firmly shut, locked from the inside, as though some invisible force had sealed them in. He pounded on the cold metal, shouting for help, but his cries were drowned out by the growing storm of ghostly whispers. "Mike, stop!" Elena shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the door. "It won't do any good. We're trapped." She turned to Jake, who had been fumbling with his camera in a daze. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. He dropped the camera to the floor, the lens shattering upon impact, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was locked on the wall behind them. Elena followed his eyes and froze. The wall, once covered in faint scratches, was now alive with movement. Thin lines like veins began to crawl across the surface, spreading like a disease. And then they began to form words, terrible words that seemed to be etched into the stone itself, as though carved by an unseen hand. "Get out. Get out now. You are ours." The temperature dropped even further, and the sound of scraping claws echoed in the room, coming from every direction. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, the clawing sounds growing louder, closer, until it was as if the very stones of the prison were alive, seeking to devour them. Elena's mind raced, but her thoughts were jumbled, clouded by panic and confusion. "We need to leave," she whispered, but there was a tremor in her voice. "We need to find a way out." But as she spoke, the shadows in the room seemed to shift and Victor's form stretched, his presence growing larger and more oppressive. The figure seemed to tower over them, his form blurring and flickering like a candle in the wind. "You think you can leave?" Victor's voice snarled, the words dripping with malevolent amusement. "This place, it doesn't let go. It owns you now. You'll never leave." A clawed hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing Sarah by the wrist. She screamed in terror, her body jerking violently as the hand tightened its grip, dragging her toward the center of the cell. Elena lunged forward, grabbing her arm, but it was as though the force pulling Sarah away was too powerful to resist. Mike reached for his flashlight, but it slipped from his hand, rolling across the floor and flickering out in the darkness. As he moved to retrieve it, he caught sight of something in the corner of the room. It was the clawed hands, dozens of them. The walls were now alive with these twisted, gnarled appendages, their fingers scratching at the air, desperate to reach the group. The children's whispers intensified, mingling with the sound of the claws scraping against the stone. "Help me!" Sarah screamed, her voice a raw, primal cry for mercy. The shadows seemed to close in on her, their touch icy and suffocating. The air grew thick with terror. Elena could feel it closing around her chest, like a vice. The walls seemed to pulse as though the prison itself was alive, feeding off their fear. "Please," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, we need to leave. We can't stay here." But then the shadows shifted again. A faint light appeared at the far end of the cell, flickering like a distant beacon. It was a vision of the prison's past, a flash of blood and violence, the sight of men shackled to the walls, screaming for mercy as the guards tortured them. The vision seemed to warp and twist, as if the prison itself was showing them its history of pain and suffering. The clawing hands grew more frantic, their scratching turning into a deafening roar, as if the prison was alive and desperate to consume them. The temperature plummeted even further, and they could hear the unmistakable sound of chains rattling, the clanging of metal against stone. Victor's shadow flickered in and out of view, his laughter rising to a deafening crescendo. "You're trapped," he growled. "This place belongs to me now. And you are just another part of the story." As the group cowered in the corner, there seemed to be no escape, no way out of this nightmare. The clawed hands continued to reach for them. The shadows closed in tighter, and the walls seemed to pulse with an insatiable hunger. It was only a matter of time before they, too, would become part of the prison's twisted history. Lost souls trapped forever within the weeping walls of Cell 27. But as the terror reached its peak, something shifted in the atmosphere. A single piercing scream echoed through the air, so loud and agonizing that it drowned out everything else. The shadows receded for a brief moment, and the clawing hands fell silent. It was as though the prison itself had momentarily released its grip, as if the spirits within were momentarily weakened. But the respite was short-lived. The momentary silence was shattered by the sounds of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Someone or something was coming. And the question remained, would they ever leave the cell alive? Or would they too become part of the haunting history that had been locked away within the walls for so many years? The moment the footsteps echoed through the oppressive silence of Cell 27, Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She froze, barely daring to breathe. The air felt thick with suffocating dread, and the shadows seemed to stretch even further, as if they were alive, curling and writhing in the dim light. The echo of the footsteps drew closer, but none of them dared to move, their fear paralyzing them in place. Elena's eyes darted nervously from Sarah, who was still crumpled on the floor, trembling with tears, to Mike, who was clinging to the wall in a dazed state. Jake, standing to her left, was the only one still holding it together, though his face was ashen, his eyes wide with terror. The spectral children, who had once appeared to be a mere illusion, now seemed far too real, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence, their hollow eyes never leaving them. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, now unmistakably human. A chill ran through Elena's spine as she realized it wasn't a hallucination. Someone or something was really here with them. But as the sound drew closer, it was clear that this wasn't a living person. It was Victor Shears, the warden of the cell, the terrifying figure who had committed unspeakable acts within these walls. His presence was unmistakable, even if his body was not visible. The oppressive energy in the room thickened, and the walls began to shake as if they were reacting to his approach. The clawed hands scraping the walls grew louder, their screeches merging into a chorus of ghostly anguish. Elena looked around frantically for a way out, but the door was still sealed. There was no window, no escape. She slammed her fist against the door, her desperation growing with each passing second. Mike joined her, both of them shouting at the door, but the howling winds outside drowned out their voices. Jake was the first to notice the change. He looked over to the far corner of the cell where, until now, there had been nothing but darkness. Slowly, a figure began to materialize from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in a shroud of blackness that seemed to absorb all light. The outline of the figure seemed to distort with every movement, and as it moved closer to them, the stench of decay and rot filled the room. "Victor," Elena whispered, though she wasn't sure if she had spoken out loud or if the name had been whispered from her own mind. The figure inched closer, its form now solidifying into the terrifying image of a man. His face twisted into an expression of pure malice. The energy in the room grew unbearable as the ghostly figure came into full view. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of his presence, and the shadows in the room thickened into something that no longer resembled mere darkness. They felt like tangible, living entities. "I warned you," Victor's voice echoed, a hollow, menacing growl that reverberated through the walls. "You think you can leave? You think you can walk away unscathed from what I've built?" The temperature in the room plummeted, and Elena could feel the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around her throat. She tried to scream, but the sound was strangled, as though the very air had turned to ice inside her lungs. Sarah, sobbing uncontrollably, looked up at the figure, her eyes wild with terror. "Leave us alone!" she cried out, but her words seemed to fuel Victor's wrath. His eyes, glowing with an unnatural, ghostly light, turned toward Sarah. He took a step forward, and the walls seemed to groan in protest as he did so. His voice, now more a growl than a sound, echoed through the room again. "You are all trespassers in my domain. There is no escaping my wrath." The shadows seemed to close in on them, as though they were alive, pushing them toward Victor. The sound of scratching claws grew louder, and from the dark recesses of the room, more figures began to emerge. More of the ghostly prisoners who had suffered Victor's cruel punishment. Their forms twisted and distorted as they moved, their faces locked in permanent expressions of pain and agony. Elena felt as though the walls were pressing in on her from all sides, the atmosphere so thick with fear that it was nearly impossible to breathe. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, but everything else, the sounds, the movement, seemed muffled as if they were underwater. She reached out for Sarah, pulling her close. "We need to get out," she gasped, but it was already too late. Victor's form lunged forward, his ghostly hands extending in their direction. Elena felt the coldness seep into her skin as his fingers brushed against her arm. The touch was like ice, a sensation so chilling it burned with a frozen fire. Then with a powerful roar, the walls began to crack. The prison seemed to shudder as if waking from a long nightmare. The chains, the torture, the suffering, it all came rushing back to the prison in one final surge of vengeful energy. Elena and her group were no longer in the physical realm. The cell disappeared, and they found themselves in the middle of the riot from years ago. The violent, chaotic moment when the prison had erupted in violence. The air was thick with smoke, and the floor was slick with blood. Screams echoed through the halls as the prison riot unfolded around them, but they were unable to move. They were trapped in the vision, watching helplessly as ghostly images of the guards and inmates fought each other in a gruesome reenactment of the death and destruction that had plagued the prison. They were trapped, unable to break free from the violent scene that unfolded around them. But through the chaos, one thing was clear. Victor Shears was still watching, still laughing. He had claimed the souls of all who had been in this prison, and now he had come for them. The ghostly figures of the prisoners surged forward, reaching out with skeletal hands, trying to drag them into the madness. In the midst of this, Elena felt something snap inside her. She could feel herself breaking free from the vision, from the horror that had locked them in. With a strength she didn't know she had, she grabbed Mike and pulled him toward the hallway leading out of the cell. They ran, blind with fear. But the prison was alive, alive with vengeance. The walls shook as though in protest, and the sound of chains rattling followed them as they fled. Finally, they found themselves at the entrance, the exit, the path to freedom. They slammed into the rusted door, and with one final push, it gave way. They tumbled into the daylight, the sunlight searing their eyes after the long hours in the dark. But as they looked back, they saw only the ruins of the prison, no longer a place of torment, but an endless, eternal shadow. Victor's laughter echoed through the wind, his voice a chilling reminder that, for some, there was no escape from the horrors they had lived through. As the group stumbled away from the prison, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the horrors they had experienced lingering in the back of their minds. They had survived, but they would never truly escape, for the prison and its warden had left their mark on them forever, and every time they closed their eyes, the darkness would return. Victor's clawing hands reaching for them once again. The old penitentiary, known for its towering stone walls and iron-barred windows, sat at the edge of a desolate stretch of land, its bleak silhouette forever etched against a sky heavy with storm clouds. The inmates, shackled and worn from years of hard labor, had no hope of ever leaving, or so it seemed. In the late 1940s, the prison was home to a group of desperate men. each with his own story of crime and regret. Among them was a hardened convict named Tommy Callahan. Tommy was a lifer, serving time for a string of robberies that had ended in murder. He had been incarcerated for nearly 20 years, but with every passing day, the desire for freedom gnawed at him more fiercely. The warden, a cruel and sadistic man named Harlan Croft, ruled with an iron fist, making any thought of escape seem futile. But in the shadows of the prison, Tommy began to hatch a plan. He wasn't alone. He had gathered a small group of inmates who shared his dream of freedom, fellow men who had been broken by the system and longed for one final chance to escape their fate. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would break out during the night, using the narrow tunnels beneath the prison as their means of escape. For weeks, they meticulously planned, scavenging tools, gathering resources, and keeping their actions hidden from the ever-watchful guards. The night of the escape finally arrived. Tommy and his gang, shackled together by iron chains, crawled through the tunnels, moving like shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of chains dragging across the stone floor echoed through the narrow passages. But the men were determined. They reached the deepest part of the prison, a flooded underground tunnel that, according to the rumors, led to an old sewage system that could take them beyond the prison walls. But as they neared the end of the tunnel, disaster struck. The warden had learned of their plans. Harlan Croft had foreseen their actions and had locked the gates to the tunnel, trapping them inside. As the floodwaters rose, the chains on the men's ankles seemed to tighten, dragging them further down. Desperation filled their lungs as they fought to stay afloat. But the weight of their chains and the rising water were too much. The men screamed in panic, but their cries were drowned out by the deafening sound of rushing water. One by one, they sank into the murky depths of the flooded passage, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Years passed, but the ghostly echoes of the men who had drowned in that tunnel never faded. The prison was abandoned in the early 1970s, its crumbling walls and rusted gates left to rot in the passage of time. However, something darker had taken root within those walls. The spirits of the chain gang, forever bound by the chains they had worn in life, began to haunt the prison. Locals in the nearby town began to report strange occurrences. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain lashed at the windows, they would hear the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. It wasn't just the wind, it was the sound of something dragging across the ground. Some claimed they saw flickers of shadowy figures moving within the prison, their silhouettes framed by the dim light of the full moon. Curiosity, as it always does, led a group of brave, or perhaps foolish, ghost hunters to the prison. The group, led by a seasoned investigator named Marcus Price, had heard the stories of the haunted penitentiary and decided to explore the source of the rumors. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a heavy dose of skepticism, they ventured into the decaying building. As they entered the prison, the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the empty corridors. It wasn't long before they heard it, the soft clinking of chains. The group froze, staring at each other in disbelief. Marcus, ever the skeptic, dismissed it as the sound of old metal settling, but the others weren't so sure. Suddenly, the air grew colder. One of the ghost hunters, a young woman named Lisa, gasped as she felt something brush against her neck. It was cold and her skin prickled with fear. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. The sound of chains dragging across the floor grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of muffled voices. Whispers echoed from the shadows, but no one was there. In a panic, the group made their way deeper into the prison, each step taking them closer to the source of the haunting. They reached the flooded tunnel, the very same tunnel where the chain gang had died. The walls were covered in damp moss, and the smell of decay filled the air. The water was still, but a strange feeling of dread filled the space. Marcus, determined to prove there was a logical explanation, pushed forward. He set up his equipment and began to record. That was when the first shadow appeared. It was barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. But then it became clearer, a tall figure dragging its chains behind it, moving slowly toward the group. The figure was wearing ragged prison clothes, its face obscured by a hood. It was one of the escaped prisoners, or at least it appeared to be. The group watched in horror as the figure stopped in front of them and raised its hand, revealing the twisted, skeletal fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward them. The chains rattled louder, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the tunnel. The group was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. It was as if the spirit of the chain gang was reaching out to claim them, to drag them down into the same watery grave that had claimed their lives decades before. The shadows stretched long in the flickering light of their flashlights as the ghost hunters pressed deeper into the prison, each step heavier than the last. The tunnel ahead seemed to warp, distorting into an unnervingly long stretch of darkness. Lisa could feel her pulse quicken as the oppressive air clung to her skin and a chill ran up her spine. She wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong. She glanced nervously at the others, her breath visible in the cold air. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice firm, though there was a tremor in it that Lisa hadn't heard before. Despite his usual skepticism, even he seemed unsettled. His usually confident demeanor was slipping, replaced by an aura of dread. "We can't let fear take over now." The deeper they went, the more intense the atmosphere became. The sound of chains dragging, faint at first, became sharper, like nails scraping against metal. It echoed all around them, above, below, behind, and ahead, as if they were already surrounded by unseen entities. They heard the splashing sound too, slow, deliberate footsteps, a heavy thudding as if someone, or something, was dragging itself through the water. Then, just as suddenly as the sounds began, they stopped. A breathless silence followed, a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the world itself had been muffled by an unseen hand. For a moment, none of them dared to speak, each one of them straining to hear any movement, any sign of what was lurking ahead. The stillness only made the rattling of chains all the more haunting when it returned. This time the rattles were accompanied by low, guttural growls, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the figure appeared. At first it was just a blur, a distortion in the air that seemed to shift in and out of focus. But then, as it stepped fully into view, they could make out its form, a tall, spectral figure, draped in tattered prison garb. Its face was obscured by shadows, but they could see its eyes, black pits of emptiness that seemed to draw the very light into them. The chains it dragged along the floor rattled with an eerie resonance, sending cold waves of terror washing over the group. It reached toward them, the chains in its grasp swinging violently, scraping against the stone floor. The sound was deafening. The figure's voice came low and rasping, like the wind through the cracked stone walls. "You should never have come here," it croaked. "You will join us now." The words hung in the air, thick with an unsettling finality. Lisa backed away, but the others remained frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the figure as it advanced. Marcus, trying to regain control, stepped forward, his voice shaking. "This is just some twisted trick. It's not real." But the moment the words left his lips, the chains swung violently toward him. Without warning, they wrapped around his ankles with a terrifying speed, pulling him off his feet and dragging him toward the shadowy figure. His scream echoed through the tunnel, but before it could even fully register, it was drowned out by the deafening crash of chains as the specter began to pull him toward the water. "Marcus!" Lisa cried, rushing forward without thinking. But before she could even reach him, the ground beneath her feet seemed to give way. She felt herself slipping into the icy, murky water of the tunnel, her legs flailing as the dark water rose around her, cold as death itself. The others were frozen in place, their terror magnified by the horrifying sight before them. They could hear Marcus's strangled cries for help, fading as the chains pulled him deeper into the water. The specter's grip was unrelenting, its form moving closer as it hovered above the water, its chains clinking and rattling with maddening force. Lisa could feel the tug of the water, pulling at her legs, threatening to drag her under as well. Her breath became erratic, her panic overwhelming as she floundered in the rising tide. But somehow she managed to push herself back toward the edge, clinging to the stone walls for dear life. Behind her, the sound of chains grew louder. Panic gripped the group now. The events unfolding were beyond anything they could have imagined. and the only instinct they had left was to flee. Marcus was gone, pulled under by the ghostly chains of the chain gang specters, and none of them could afford to end up like him. The sound of the chains was deafening now, as if the entire prison was filled with the rattling of countless ghostly prisoners. "We have to get out of here," Steve shouted, his face a mask of terror. "Where are we supposed to go?" "The exit is blocked," Lisa said, her voice raw with panic. She had to force herself to focus. There was no time for uncertainty. In the growing chaos, the remaining members of the group tried to find their way back to the entrance. But the prison, which had once seemed like a decaying labyrinth, now felt like a living, breathing entity intent on keeping them trapped. Every turn they took seemed to lead them further into the bowels of the forsaken place. The walls closed in on them as if the prison itself were alive, rejecting their attempts at escape. The sound of chains dragging became unbearable, punctuated by the occasional gasp or gurgle that emanated from the deep recesses of the flooded passages. Then the shadows seemed to shift again, coalescing into figures, more specters emerging from the water, moving toward them with outstretched hands, their eyes glowing like embers. Lisa felt her heart race as one of the figures reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against her arm. She cried out in terror, but the figure didn't seem to register her scream. It merely continued dragging its chains along the floor, its gaze never leaving her. She stumbled backward, but the spirit followed, moving closer as the chains rattled in a violent fury. "This isn't happening," Steve muttered as he turned to find an escape. His eyes were wide with fear, but his steps faltered as he scanned the room. He had no idea which way to go, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to close in on him. "We can't keep running," Lisa shouted to the others. "We need to find a way out now." The group moved as one, stumbling through the flooded passage, the sound of chains growing louder with each step. They had to make it to the exit before the spirits fully claimed them. But even as they reached what seemed to be a door, the chains tightened around their legs. The water surged, pulling them down again. The entrance to the exit seemed farther away now, an endless stretch of darkness between them and safety. Suddenly, the door they had been rushing toward slammed shut with a deafening crash. The spirits were closing in, and now they were trapped again. Despair set in as the chains rattled around them, their only hope of escape slipping through their fingers. Desperation and fear clouded the minds of the group. The specters of the chain gang circled them, their chains scraping against the wet stone floor, dragging behind them as they advanced with terrifying patience. Every breath was thick with the stench of decay and the foul waters of the underground tunnel. It felt as if the air itself was being sucked out of the room, pressing in on them from every side. There was no escape, no place to hide. Lisa was panting, her heart hammering in her chest as she turned toward the others. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but no one could respond. Their faces were etched with terror, their eyes wide with the knowledge that they were running out of time. They could feel the very walls closing in on them. "Look, there's a way out!" Steve shouted suddenly, his voice hoarse. He pointed to a rusted door on the far wall, one that hadn't been visible before, hidden in the shadows of the crumbling corridor. It was the only glimmer of hope they'd seen since the start of the nightmare. Without hesitation, they bolted toward it, their feet splashing in the water. But as they neared the door, a cold, bone-chilling gust of wind rushed toward them, and the shadows began to writhe again. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she felt the temperature drop even further. There was something wrong, so terribly wrong, about the way the shadows twisted. The figures, now closer than ever, weren't just approaching. They were waiting. The door was locked. Steve yanked at the rusted metal handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The rattling of chains grew louder behind them, drowning out all sound. The specters were closing in. There was no time left. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to shift. The rattling stopped. The footsteps ceased. For a moment, an unsettling silence descended. A low, growling voice echoed from the darkness, reverberating through the walls. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was not one, but many, as if 1,000 voices were speaking as one. It resonated from the walls themselves, from the damp stone, from the very earth beneath their feet. It was an overwhelming sound that seemed to vibrate in their bones. The chains fell silent. the shadows still. The specters of the chain gang began to retreat, not attacking, but pulling back into the darkness. The chains fell still, the echoes of the past had shifted, and the specters no longer seemed intent on dragging them into the water. They hovered in the distance, watching, waiting. Their forms flickered in and out of existence, as if the prison itself was uncertain whether it should release them or keep them there forever. Lisa could feel her heart pounding against her ribs as the silence dragged on. Then slowly, the door she had tried to open creaked, and with a groan of protest, it swung inward. The darkness behind it felt endless, but there was no time to hesitate. Without thinking, Lisa grabbed the handle and pulled. The others followed her, and one by one, they stepped through the threshold into the black void beyond. As they crossed the doorway, everything around them seemed to shift. The oppressive weight of the tunnel vanished in an instant. They were outside, blinking in the light of the full moon, breathing in the cool night air. But something felt off. The world around them seemed too quiet, too still. They looked around, trying to orient themselves, but the prison was nowhere to be seen. The dilapidated walls, the flooded passageways, and the ghostly figures had all disappeared. They were in an unfamiliar field, open land stretching far into the distance. It was then that they realized the truth. They hadn't just escaped the prison, they had escaped time itself. The prison they had entered was not the one they had left. The layout was different, and the old rusted doors were gone. The air was clean, free of the suffocating stench of decay. But as they looked back toward where the prison had been, they saw only rolling hills. The concrete structure, the iron bars, the underground tunnels, they were all gone. The shadows still lingered, however. As Lisa stood there, staring at the moonlit horizon, she felt a strange sensation, a growing weight on her chest. It was as if something was tugging at her, trying to pull her back. Then she heard it. Chains. The sound of chains dragging across the dirt, rattling like the wind through the leaves, but louder, closer. It grew louder with every passing second, the clinking sound like 1,000 shackles dragging through the earth. It was unmistakable. The specters had followed them, still tethered to their world, and now they had crossed into it. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat as she turned, but there was no one there. No figures in prison garb, no ghostly figures trailing chains. Just the heavy sound of clinking, rattling chains, echoing louder in the silence of the night. The ground beneath them trembled. The wind picked up, and in the distance a flash of light ignited the dark horizon. Then she saw it. The warden. His silhouette appeared at the top of a hill, towering over them in the moonlight. He wasn't human anymore. He was something far worse. His face was a blank mask, featureless and twisted, his arms outstretched like a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. His chains rattled violently, and his hollow eyes stared into the soul of each of them. "You shouldn't have run," his voice boomed, low and monstrous, reverberating in their minds. "You will never escape." The ground shook violently now, and Lisa could feel it in her bones. The specters, their chains still dragging, began to emerge from the earth itself. The air turned frigid, and the once still field seemed to warp around them. The prison was not gone. It had never left. They were still trapped in it, bound to its legacy, bound to the warden's curse. And as the group stared in horror, the realization hit them. The prison was not just a place. It was an endless loop, a nightmare they were doomed to live over and over again. The specters were not confined to the walls of the prison. They were the prison, and until the final soul was claimed, the chains would never stop rattling. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest, but as the specters began to close in, she realized something terrifying. The chains were no longer pulling her toward the prison. They were pulling her backward through the earth. The warden's curse had not ended. It had only begun. The prison had stood for over a century, its walls built from cold, unfeeling stone, and its halls haunted by the whispers of the damned. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of the past pressing down on you the moment you stepped inside. The oldest wing, known as Cell Block D, was the most notorious part of the prison, closed off to the public after the events that had transpired there decades ago. No one spoke openly about what happened, But everyone knew. The legend of the demon who had possessed an inmate named Robert Hall had become part of the prison's lore. It was said that Robert had been just another violent, hardened criminal, until something inside him snapped. His descent into madness had started quietly, but soon he began displaying unnatural strength and an eerie, unnatural hunger for blood. Guards who had once found him manageable now feared him. It was in the dead of night when Robert's transformation reached its apex. A few guards had entered his cell to administer routine checks when they found him staring into the wall, his hands bound in shackles. His eyes were glazed over, and his body was twisted in ways that were not humanly possible. He growled at them, low and guttural, his voice no longer his own but something deeper, darker, and far more sinister. The transformation had begun, and when it reached its peak, Robert broke free of his chains, his once mild demeanor replaced by an overwhelming, otherworldly rage. He tore into the guards with a ferocity that sent them screaming through the halls. Blood soaked the concrete floors as Robert slaughtered anyone who came near. Those who survived reported hearing inhuman growls and whispers in the darkened corners of the cell block, like something was hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting to pounce. When more guards arrived, they found Robert standing in the middle of the cell, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred, surrounded by the bodies of those he had killed. The warden at the time, a man named Samuel Drake, had heard the stories about possession and demons, but he never believed in such nonsense. That is, until he witnessed Robert's violent rampage firsthand. It was said that in his final moments, Robert looked straight at the warden and uttered chilling words. "You will burn like me." What happened next is unclear. Some say that the guards and warden forced Robert into submission, locking him in the deepest cell in the block and setting the entire wing on fire, thinking the flames would cleanse the demon within him. Others claim that Robert had simply vanished, consumed by the flames before he could burn to death. When the smoke cleared, Robert was gone. No one found his body. The fire had destroyed the wing, and with it, the evidence of what had truly happened. But the whispers and growls never stopped. Something had survived, and from that moment on, Cell Block D became a place of fear, avoided by even the bravest of souls. The years passed, and the prison eventually closed its doors, becoming just another abandoned relic of the past. However, for paranormal investigators, the prison remained a treasure trove of dark history and spectral activity. No place was more sought after than Cell Block D. The reputation of Robert Hall's demonic possession lingered in the air, drawing the attention of one such group, a team of ghost hunters known as the Shadow Seekers. The team, led by an experienced investigator named Evelyn Moore, had spent years exploring the darkest corners of the world's most haunted locations. They had captured footage of apparitions, EVP recordings of chilling voices, and even physical evidence of poltergeist activity. But nothing had prepared them for the terror that awaited them in the prison's oldest wing. Evelyn and her team arrived at the prison on a cold, rainy night. The decaying structure loomed ahead, the moon casting an eerie glow on the crumbling stone walls. The team entered through the front gate, their flashlights flickering against the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. They made their way towards Cell Block D, the air growing colder with each step. The prison had been abandoned for years, but it still felt alive with malevolent energy. The group set up cameras in the hallways, strategically placing them in areas known for the most paranormal activity. They began their investigation, starting with the cells that had once housed the prisoners of the old wing. As Evelyn walked down the long corridor, she felt a presence behind her. It wasn't just a feeling. It was as though something was there, just out of sight, watching her every move. She turned around but saw nothing. Her breath quickened, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could hear faint whispers, too soft to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry and full of hate. "Did you hear that?" one of the team members, Danny, asked, his voice shaky. "I did," Evelyn replied, her voice low and tense. "But don't worry, we've encountered far worse before. Let's stay focused." But even Evelyn couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. The temperature in the cell block dropped rapidly, the air thick with an oppressive heaviness. The only sounds were the distant drip of water, the creak of the old building settling, and the faint echo of something dragging across the floor. It was then that they heard it. A growl, low, guttural, and inhuman. It seemed to come from all around them, surrounding them in the darkness. It was a sound that sent chills down their spines, a sound that made their blood run cold. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The growl intensified, becoming louder, more violent. The air was thick with tension as the team gathered together, unsure of what they were facing. Suddenly, they heard a loud bang, followed by a crash. Danny, who was standing nearest to one of the cell doors, stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. It's moving," he whispered, pointing at the door that had just slammed shut on its own. They rushed toward it, only to hear a voice on their EVP recorder, a low, raspy voice that sent chills through their spines. "Get out, or burn like me." As Evelyn and her team huddled together, the cold air of the cell block intensified, making their breath visible in the dim light of their flashlights. Their senses were heightened, every creak of the building sending jolts of panic through their bodies. They had come to explore the mysteries of Cell Block D, to uncover the truth behind the terrifying legends. But nothing could have prepared them for what was happening now. The entity they had unleashed had not only survived, it had grown more powerful. The growling continued to reverberate through the hall, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the floor. It was as if an invisible force was pulling them deeper into the heart of the prison, where the darkest corners of the building seemed to consume the light. The whispers from before had turned into frantic, incoherent screams, and the temperature in the hall dropped even further. A violent gust of wind swept through the narrow hallway, sending a chill so deep it cut through to their bones. Their breath came out in visible clouds, the only sound in the stillness being the thudding of their hearts and the sharp, dragging scrape of chains across the floor. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Danny, the youngest of the team, was the first to break the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, his face pale and stricken with fear. "It's not just a ghost, it's something else. Something alive, and it's angry." Evelyn didn't need to be told twice. She felt it too. The overwhelming sense that something was watching them. Something far more sinister than the restless spirit of Robert Hall. The walls, which had seemed so solid moments ago, now felt as though they were pressing in, suffocating the team. Each step felt like a weight on their chest, as though the building itself was trying to hold them there, trapping them in its malignant grip. The growls intensified. It was no longer a sound of a human, nor even an animal. It was something primal, something ancient, something beyond the realm of understanding. It seemed to echo from every direction, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread, like the air itself was thick with the promise of suffering. Evelyn turned to her team, trying to maintain control, though her hands were trembling. "We need to stay together," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "If we split up, we'll be picked off one by one. Stick together and keep your cameras rolling. This is what we came for." Her words, though meant to rally her team, did little to calm them. The others nodded nervously, but their faces were pale, fear evident in their eyes. They could hear the sound of chains moving closer, the rattling becoming louder with each passing second. It was as though the chains themselves were walking, dragging their unseen victim behind them. "Do you see that?" Danny's voice quivered as he pointed toward the end of the hallway. A flicker of light appeared, just for a moment, barely enough to register, but enough to draw their attention. The faintest outline of a figure emerged from the shadows, barely discernible but undeniable. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The figure's face was hidden in darkness, but the eyes, those eyes, glowed with a malevolent, fiery red. They pierced the gloom like two burning coals staring directly at the group. The figure's mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, wide enough to reveal sharp, needle-like teeth. In that moment, Evelyn felt the full weight of the evil that had taken root in this place. This was no longer just a haunting. It was something that had lived on in this cell block for years, something that had fed off the hatred and violence that had plagued the prison. The spirit of Robert Hall, or whatever had taken his body, was no longer the threat. It was the entity that had possessed him, the true evil. "Run!" Evelyn screamed, but her voice was barely heard over the deafening sound of chains crashing to the floor. The entity began to move, its form shifting and warping as it glided toward them, its chains rattling like thunder. They turned to flee, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. The walls shifted, distorting the layout of the building, as if the prison itself was alive and rearranging itself to trap them. Doors that had once led to stairwells now opened into dark voids, and windows that should have let in light were now blackened, showing only the reflection of their terrified faces. "We're not getting out," Danny gasped, his voice breaking as the walls seemed to close in on them. The growling was now a roar, deafening, and they could feel the air vibrating around them, thick with evil. They ran down the hallway, desperate to escape, but the chains were catching up with them. Each time they looked over their shoulders, they saw the figure, closer, always closer. The growls were deafening, reverberating in their skulls, pushing them to the edge of madness. "Is anyone else seeing this?" shouted one of the other team members, Maria. She pointed toward the ceiling. A shadow was moving across it, scratching, clawing, its fingers like tendrils, scraping against the stone. As it crawled, it left deep gouges in the wall, like it was marking its territory. The team reached a set of iron bars that separated them from the main corridor. They slammed into it, pulling at the gate, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The sound of chains dragging grew louder and louder, until it was all-consuming. Evelyn felt the floor tremble beneath her feet, as though the entire building was shaking with rage. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further. The air turned frigid, and an icy wind swept through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights. The shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them, tugging at their clothes and hair, as though trying to pull them into the darkness. And then, just as the sound of chains seemed to overwhelm them, it stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence. The growling ceased. The dragging chains were no longer audible. It felt as though they were suspended in time, their hearts pounding in their chests, breath coming in short, terrified gasps. But the silence was not comforting. It was the calm before the storm. The ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening sound, and from the darkened depths, a massive shape emerged. It was no longer just a figure or a shadow. It was an entity of nightmare, an embodiment of rage and hatred. The chains it was bound with rattled and crashed against the ground, the sheer weight of them enough to shake the walls of the cell block. The creature was enormous, with glowing red eyes and claws that seemed to stretch far beyond the human form. It was here, and now there was no escape. The creature loomed above them, towering and monstrous. Its presence distorted the air, the very fabric of reality warping around it. The chains that it dragged behind it rattled like 1,000 violent storms, reverberating through the entire prison. Evelyn, Danny, Maria, and the rest of the team could barely process what they were seeing. The entity had no true form. It was as though the darkness itself had taken shape, an amalgamation of nightmare and rage. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but her instincts took over. "Stay together," she shouted, though the words barely reached her own ears, drowned out by the deafening sound of chains clanking and dragging across the floor. The figure's eyes, fiery, burning orbs, fixed on them, and the growling that followed was like a freight train barreling toward them, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Maria reached for her camera, the one tool they had hoped would document the terrifying truth. She fumbled with it, but it slipped from her hands. The creature moved closer, a malevolent shadow overtaking the space where once the team had stood, fearless. Now they were all trapped in this nightmare. But then, something unexpected happened. The air shifted, flickering like a dying light bulb. A low, guttural voice reverberated through the walls, an ancient, deep growl. "You're too late. It's already too late for all of you." The words were inhuman, yet they held a terrifying weight. As if in response, the shadows thickened. The walls of cell block D began to close in, narrowing until it felt like the very building was suffocating them. Their flashlights flickered out, and the oppressive darkness pressed in like a living thing. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. No, this can't be happening." She grabbed Danny's arm, pulling him toward the exit. But it was no use. The hallway they had come through had disappeared. In its place was a maze of twisted, contorted metal bars and jagged stone. The prison, it seemed, was alive, and it had trapped them. In the distance, a low cackle echoed through the cell block. The voice of the creature, now unmistakably filled with twisted glee, whispered, "I am the warden. I am the judge. I am the executioner." The growl returned, louder now, shaking the air. The floor beneath them rumbled, and the walls cracked and moaned as if the entire building was in agony. The chains grew louder, their rattle deafening, as they swarmed around the group like an overwhelming flood. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the figure's form became clearer. A grotesque amalgamation of human and beast, its skin marked by the remnants of fire and burns, eyes glowing with malicious hunger. Evelyn tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating her voice. Maria gasped for air, clutching at her chest, her eyes wide with terror. Danny, shaking, pointed at the floor. "It's here! It's coming for us!" The shadows erupted, swirling violently around the group, slamming them into the walls. It felt as though the air itself had become a prison, tightening around them with every breath. "Get out! Get out of here!" Evelyn screamed, but it was too late. The chains lashed out from the shadows, wrapping themselves around their bodies, pulling them into the darkness. They fought back, but the chains were relentless, tightening until they could barely breathe. Then, as though answering the creature's call, the floor cracked open, and they were sucked into a vortex of darkness. The sensation of falling consumed them, and Evelyn felt her body plummet into the abyss, a sharp, cold sensation coursing through her veins. But just as suddenly as the fall began, it stopped. The sensation of falling vanished. They were no longer in the prison, nor in the cell block. They were somewhere else entirely. Evelyn opened her eyes, blinking against the sharp sting of light. They were no longer in the dark, decaying corridors of the prison. Instead, they found themselves standing in what appeared to be a vast, empty void. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and dry, as though the very earth had been scorched. There were no walls, no ceilings, just an endless expanse of nothingness stretching in all directions. The growls had ceased, but the air still felt thick with malevolent energy. The only sound that remained was the distant clanking of chains. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the shadows, a low, menacing tone that sent chills down their spines. "You're still here. You've always been here." It was the creature, but it was no longer the twisted form they had seen before. Its shape flickered and shifted, as though it were a reflection in a broken mirror, constantly shifting between forms, man, beast, and something darker, more ancient. Its eyes burned like hot coals, its smile twisted with a hunger that seemed to transcend anything human. "You think you've escaped," the voice taunted, echoing in their minds. "But I have you now. You are part of this place. You always will be." Evelyn's heart raced as the realization hit her. This wasn't just a haunted prison. It wasn't just a trapped spirit. It was something far worse. The prison was a prison for souls, and they were its latest victims. "Why are we here?" Maria gasped, her voice trembling with fear. "What do you want from us?" The entity's form flickered again, and for a brief moment, Evelyn could see the horrific images of past prisoners and guards, men and women who had once walked these halls, twisting and writhing in agony, their faces locked in eternal screams. They were all trapped in this endless void. "You are the chosen ones," the entity whispered. "You were brought here to join them, to suffer as they did." The chains rumbled louder, the sound now deafening as they began to wrap around the team, pulling them toward the figure in the shadows. "You will never leave. You will become one with the prison. Forever." Evelyn's mind raced. She couldn't accept this. They couldn't just become part of this endless nightmare. She thought of the countless souls that had died in this place, and the entity, this thing that had claimed them. It wasn't just haunting the prison, it was feeding off their fear, their suffering. With an instinct she couldn't explain, Evelyn reached deep within herself. She grasped her flashlight and, using all her strength, swung it toward the dark figure. The light burst through the shadows, illuminating the space around them. For a brief moment, the chain stopped moving, and the entity screeched in fury. But it wasn't enough. The prison's grip on them was too strong. With one final scream, Evelyn and her team were sucked into the void, their cries lost in the endless expanse. And in the distance, from the heart of the prison's deepest shadows, the growling began again. The cycle was about to repeat. This is the twisted, cyclical conclusion to their terrifying journey, where they are trapped within the very realm they sought to escape, the entity now feeding off their souls as it had with countless others. The story closes, leaving the horrific fate of the team ambiguous yet inevitable, fated to join the ranks of the tormented souls forever trapped in the prison.